tamis ng alak, nangulang sintamis ng alak. Tagayan, 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 tagayan. Awitin, awitin ng haran at kundiman, kumintang ng ilog at gubat, kumintang ng ilog at lipunan. Sa haba ng panahong nagdaan, mga pagbabago'y patuloy mong inaasam. Ito'y wala sa pamumuno ng ilan. Ito sana'y maging aral ng kasaysayan. Ngayon na ang panahon, kaibigan. Huwag na magpatali sa iyong nakaraan. Pagkilos mo'y dapat pagbayuhin. Tawag ng panahon, bigyan mo ng pansin.
Mga anak ko, kayo ay aking aasahan. Hindi niyo hahayaang maghari ang kasamaan. Sa awit ng paglaya, awitan ninyo ako. Nang aking pangambay tuluyang maglaho.
pag-asang makaalpas. Pilipinas kong minumutya, pugad ng luha ko't dalita. Aking adhika, makita kang saktan. Laya.
Kapag ka ang awit at tulay na lagas, ang diwa ng lahi harap sa pag-agnas. Habang may pulubing latak ng lipunan, habang may bulaklak sa esterong buhay, habang nasa burak, yaring katarungan, at ang paninil, ang Diyos, Diyosan. Di ako tutula sa mga bulaklak, di ako aawit para lang sa liyag. Ang tutulan ko'y piping pagkapuha. Sa hibon ng dilim, magkitang liwanag. Ang tutulan ko'y piping pagkapuha. Sa hibon ng dilim, magkitang liwanag.
Bayang magiliw, perwas ng silanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y bungay. Lupang hinirang, buyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka masisingil. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mo baka, may nilang ang tula at awit sa paglayang nilalaan. Ang kisap ng watawat mo'y nagumpay na nakikinig. Ang bituin ng araw niya, kailan mapali magdidilig. Lupa ng araw na maraming pagsita, kulay langit sa likod. Aming ligaya naman may mamagin, at namatay ng dahil sa'yo.
I assure you that this is not a precipitate decision, that I have weighed all the factors.
Yan. So isang mapagpalayang araw sa ating lahat, sa mga kasama natin dito sa Zoom at sa mga nanonood kasama natin sa pamamagitan ng Facebook at YouTube. Naway nasa maayos tayong kalagayan at sana ay marami kayong napagtanto at natutunan nitong mga nakaraang araw. Ako po si Jason Paulo Teles, isang katuwang na propesor mula sa Department of Communication ng Universidad ng Pilipinas sa Baguio at ako ang magsisilbing tagapagdaloy ng ating programa ngayong araw. Malugod namin kayong tinatanggap muli dito sa huling araw ng UP Days of Remembrance 2021 na may temang dambana ng gunita, mga batayang katotohanan at aral ng batas militar. So nitong mga nakarang araw, sinikap natin sa pamamagitan ng mga serye ng mga webinar, ng mga presentasyon, at mga pagtatanghal na bigyang linaw at pabulaanan ang mga mito at kasinungalingan ukol sa martial law at sa panahon ng ditadurang Marcos. Binigyan din natin ng plataporma ang mga naratibong tila pilit na binubura at pinapatahimik ng ilang mga pamilya at kung sino-sino gamit ang iba't ibang pamamaraan ng pagpapakalat ng propaganda at maging ng mga troll machineries. Ngayong araw, samahan ninyo kaming galugarin at siyasatin kung ano nga ba ang batayang katotohanan at maging ang mga ebidensya laban sa ipinapakalat na wala umanong ninakaw si Marcos mula sa Kaban ng Bayan. Para umpisahan ang ating programa at para maipakilala ang mga eksperto at kanilang mga magiging paksa ngayong araw, pakinggan natin ang ating historiador at profesor ng kasaysayan mula sa Department of History and Philosophy ng Universidad ng Pilipinas, Baguio, na si Dr. Maria Nela Florendo. Dr. Florendo?
Magandang umaga po sa lahat. I welcome all of you to the last of the webinars for the 2021 UP Day of Remembrance. After earlier webinars dislodged myths on martial law, we know that the period of martial law was never a golden age of Philippine development. Today's webinar exposes another tentacle of martial law and dictatorships. Plunder, pandarambong pagnanakaw sa kaban ng bayan. We have three formidable speakers, all committed academics and practitioners. On behalf of the committee, I thank Dr. Belinda Aquino, Professor Emeritus of the University of Hawaii, Attorney Ruben Carranza, former PCGG Commissioner, now Senior Expert of the International Center for Transitional Justice, and Dr. Ronald Mendoza, Dean of the Ateneo School of Government, for their time and commitment to deliver a talk for this morning's webinar. I wish also to acknowledge the assistance of Dr. Federico Magdalena of the University of Hawaii for the assistance provided to Dr. Lindy Aquino and Dr. Bernardita Churchill and Diling Weller for connecting us to Dr. Lindy Aquino. Let the learnings from this day's webinar and the 2021 UP Day of Remembrance webinars resonate in our classrooms, our institutions, organizations, our mass actions, our daily life, as we continue to battle the ills of our society. History will never be kind to dictators. History never forgets. History will always remember. This should be our weapon in battling historical revisionism that continues to creep into our everyday life through social media. The battle does not end with these webinars. Never again to martial law. Maraming salamat po.
Yan. So maraming salamat po Professor Florendo sa pagpapakilala sa ating tema at mga tatalakayin ng mga ating tagapagsalita sa araw na to. So huwag na tayong magpatumpik-tumpik pa. Ngayon po, mapunta na po tayo sa ating pangunahing tagapagsalita na si Dr. Belinda Aquino. So ipapakilala ko muna siya. Si Dr. Belinda A. Aquino ay isang Professor Emeritus ng University of Hawaii at Manoa, kung saan siya ay nagsilbing profesor ng Political Science at Asian Studies sa loob ng 40 taon bago siya magretiro noong 2010 lamang. Marami na siyang nailathalang mga libro, monograph, book reviews, commentaries, mga pananaliksik, at iba pang mga materyales sa iba't ibang international na journal at publications. Bilang isang periodista din o journalist, siya ay kasalukuyang contributing editor ng Hawaii Filipino Chronicle at isang contributor sa iba't ibang international, national at local publications. Ngayon, ating pakinggan mula mismo sa Hawaii si Professor Emeritus Belinda Aquino at kanyang presentasyon na pinamagatang The Transnational Dynamics of the Marcos Global Plunder. Dr. Lindy? Dr. Lindy, nandyan na po ba kayo?
The video has been stopped for a while. So, okay. Okay.
Ayan po. Magandang umaga po, Dr. Lindy.
Thank you so much. Magandang hapon sa iyo, sa lahat na nagpa-participate ng webinar na ito. Umpisahan ko ang aking pyesa ngayon na siguro it will take about just over 20 minutes, okay? This presentation attempts to piece together the dimensions of the Marcos plunder in the 1970s and 80s in the Philippines, which is unprecedented in the political history of the country, if not in most other countries that had suffered under similar dictatorships. While various forms of corruption, which have always existed in the Philippines since its beginning as a sovereign nation state, it reached epidemic and flagrant proportions during the Marcos years. Previously, corruption in the country tended to occur in certain sectors of government and its various bureaucracies that have been mostly associated with the incidence of graft and corruption and other forms of illegal activities, such as the police, internal revenue services, customs collections, licensing, and other sectors that provided opportunities for less blatant forms of corrupt activity. The political vocabulary of Filipinos then included such illegal activities as pangkape, meaning extortion, tong, another form of petty extortion, and other variants reflecting their familiarity with the kinds of behavior from the people in power or various bureaucratic agencies that they had to deal with. Of course, these types of petty corruption still exist today. This is not to excuse the corruption of the old regime, but to provide a perspective in which the various forms and carried out by the Marcos years could be better viewed and understood. As early as during his legal presidency during the 1960s, Marcos and his so-called trophy wife, Imelda, had already acquired millions of dollars that they had stashed abroad. When Marcos's second term expired, he was only 55 years old, and he thought he was too young to retire from the political arena. He manipulated the 1971 Constitutional Convention to amend certain portions or provisions of the existing constitution which had existed since 1935. Marcos succeeded in continuing being president of the country by using the communist and Muslim insurgencies to prolong his stay in power. It was not long before the New York Times revealed in a stunning story that the Marcos presidency has built an, quote, empire of gold, oil, land, and cash, end of quote. The whole country was more than stunned by the earth-shaking findings detailed by the New York Times story. Examples of the Marcos empire of gold can be seen in the summary form below that I've listed, but I've not included every incidents or example because this would be too long for this article. Number one, how did they carry out the plunder? And what was revealed by this exposure of the plunder? Number one, multi-million Swiss bank accounts, with one account alone holding a deposit of 800 million. Number two, lists of deposits to Swiss, American, and Cayman Islands banks reported to have been found in Marcos's suitcase amounting to 88 billion 750 million and 447 million. That's in the billions. Number three, total interest 1974 and 1975 only lists $30 million in Swiss, Paris, and Cayman banks. Number four, commissions quote unquote, from Japanese and American companies, with the Westinghouse Corporation giving 11.2 million in connection with the Bataan nuclear power plant project. Bataan is a province outside of Manila. Number 5, a listing of shares from Philippine gambling casinos, reportedly managed by one of Imelda's brothers, totaling 109.6 million from 1976 to 1980, or for only a brief period of 4 years. Number 6, vouchers signed by Marcos against a Philippine intelligence fund for Imelda's trips to Baghdad, Nairobi, New York, Mexico, and other places, amounting to 1.5 million. One trip alone of Imelda Marcos to these various places. Number 7 is a lucky number also for Imelda, who paid and received a receipt for 1,431,000 from Bulgari in New York for 6 pieces of jewelry, including a $1 million platinum bracelet with 14 emeralds and 14 diamonds. Most revelations of the Marcos' unbelievable plunder of the Philippines surfaced when the U.S. Customs in Honolulu made an inventory of the contents of the 2 planes that flew the Marcoses in exile to Hawaii in the middle of the night on September 25, 1986. The customs inspectors took several days to list and determine the value of the loot brought in by the Marcos couple and their cronies. The pearl collection alone was measured as occupying 48 square feet. You can imagine how big that is. And the watches from Seiko to Rolex and other brands were enough to stock several department stores. The inventory by the Customs Service even showed one large wooden crate containing a, dig this, statue of the Santo Niño, the infant Jesus of Prague, which meant that even religious objects was not spared from the Marcos plunder. It was as though they had robbed the whole Philippines of its major treasures, cultural, religious, material, and otherwise. Altogether, there were 300 crates of the Marcos' incredible loot, 22 of which contained nearly the equivalent of $1.4 million in freshly minted Philippine pesos, the currency of the Philippines, that the Central Bank of the Philippines later sought to recover. It was not reported whether the bank was able to recover the whole or even just a part of the currency that the Marcoses carried in boxes when they fled to Hawaii, disguised as pampers for the Marcos children, quote unquote. To conclude this part of this presentation, it would be instructive to approach the Marcoses' behavior of lust and greed from the perspective of political pathology, quote unquote. More than that, a Catholic nun who saw the unraveling of Malacanang Palace ruefully commented, I think it was Sister Mariani, saying, "I'm appalled by the greed. In the palace, I saw all the 7 cardinal sins." To add a more dramatic comment, Jaime Cardinal Sin, the feisty Archbishop of Manila, commented upon seeing the palace, quote, "In fact, I saw all the 7 deadly sins," single quotes supplied by me. Coming from one the iconic Archbishop of Manila, this statement came from an authoritative figure. And I had at this point referred to my notes to see what these 7 deadly sins were. And I'm just listing them here by the terms that they were called. Number one is lust. Number two of the cardinal sins is gluttony. Number three is greed. Number four is envy. Number five is sloth. Number six is pride. And number seven is wrath. As often happens with dictators intoxicated with greed and power, Marcos carried an air of invincibility. Streets, buildings, and structures in Philippine society were named after him, his family, and his cronies. A state university system in his home province of Ilocos Norte was named after Mariano Marcos, his father, who was an undistinguished politician and suspected collaborator with the Japanese occupation of the Philippines at the start of the Second World War in 1942. After declaring martial law, Marcos made it more grandiose than it really was. He installed a pair of throne-like chairs in Malacanang Palace, designed as the seat of power in the whole country. Other public buildings portrayed Ferdinand as malakas, meaning strong, and Imelda as maganda, which means beautiful or attractive. This was really a throwback to the Adam and Eve biblical creation of the first man and woman in the world. The couple always wanted to appear bigger than life itself, dispensing bounty and benefits to their fellow mortals and followers. The couple, intoxicated as they were with their seemingly endless power, had developed a quote-unquote personality cult, promoting themselves as father and mother of the entire nation. The entire vanity of the Marcoses came within construction of a 20-foot monument of Marcoses' head on the mountaintop of a boundary territory between the provinces of La Union and Benguet. The mammoth bust was later preserved by the incoming presidential Aquino administration after the downfall of Marcos and his regime as, quote, a symbol of Marcos's megalomania and loss of touch with reality, unquote. Eventually, it became an object of hate and ridicule, especially by the native tribe community. I think they were called the Kankanais, was used to construct this monstrosity tribute to Marcos. The community members wanted their land back to build their own homes. Anyone who saw this bust of Marcos thought it was an Orwellian, quote unquote, structure that probably conceived by Marcos himself when he was still in power to look like the American presidential busts in Mount Rushmore in the state of South Dakota in the US. The then Prime Minister under President turned dictator Marcos said that the latter had wanted a status symbol to, quote, make Filipinos proud of their history and culture. This was a takeoff from the Marcoses' oft-repeated pronouncements and his profound sense of history. Actually, those who had known Marcos personally characterized him as a simple man who neither smoked nor drank and just loved good Ilocano food with his heavy content of fish and vegetables. Some believed that wealth by itself did not seem to attract him. Quote, he is a very penny-pinching old wag who always thinks about politics. That's the fire that drives him, quote unquote. This was said by one individual who knew Marcos quite well in a personal way, perhaps a kababayan or townmate. So this tells you that Marcos had a warlord approach to the presidency, as remarked by many of his cabinet members when he was still a legal president. But instead of using his vast powers to reform Philippine society, he used them to perpetuate himself in power by manipulating the 1973 Constitution, which was tailored for him in the first place. He essentially used his power and authority to enrich himself while in office and create a continuing Marcos dynasty. To cut a long story short again, Imelda contributed much to the Marcoses' downfall from power, eventual downfall. One lesson that can be derived from all their greed and wheeling and dealing is that these factors were responsible for their own eventual falls from power, which the couple had mishandled and used so badly. From all these accounts, as well as others which are too numerous to detail in this brief presentation because it would occupy this whole article, I will mention examples of how the Marcoses lost their sense of reality, and this would eventually lead them to fall from power, which the couple had already misused to begin with. The the third section of my presentation is called Plunder of the Ages. It was as though this couple had run amok, looting everywhere they could find more to do. And the major cronies and lawyers carried out the unprecedented so-called plunder of the ages in the Philippines using ways which are summarized below. Number one, outright takeover of large private enterprises belonging to the Marcos major political owners like the Lopezes and others considered as not supporting his regime. Creating monopolies or state enterprises for vital sectors of the economy, such as sugar, coconut, tobacco, construction, shipping, and other service industries. Number three, awarding government loans and other public resources to favored individuals or who were acting as fronts of or were beholden to Marcos cronies, and of course to Marcos and Imelda. This was later popularized by the term crony capitalism to indicate this kind of managing the economy for themselves and their purposes and followers. I'm sorry. Number four, use of offshore holding corporations and business ventures sheltered from taxes and to conceal profits as well as ownership of bank accounts. Number five, receiving or extracting kickbacks and commissions from firms and companies doing or wanting to do business in the Philippines. Number six, scheming of foreign aid and other forms of international assistance into private hands. Number seven, direct raiding of the public treasury, the Philippine treasury that is. And eight, smuggling or salting dollar salting abroad. And this is better known as capitalist flight. Okay, this information and data are drawn largely from more than 2,500 documents and papers which surfaced after the downfall of Marcos in 1986. Known as the Marcos Papers, quote unquote. They include bank records, certificates of deposits, contracts, personal communications and notes, listing of properties, and other information on the business dealings of Marcos and his cronies. The inventory of plane loads of assets was a veritable mine of information, and this wealth is stashed away at the last minute when the Marcos group fled to Hawaii. There were also other documents related to the Swiss bank accounts of the Marcos couple with coded methods for the deposit or withdrawal of money, lists of contracts, and parties mandated to deposit or withdraw money for the Marcoses, signature specimens, and financial statements. These were used by the incoming Aquino administration to file a criminal case against Marcos and other defendants in July 1986. Most of these papers were found in the presidential palace after Marcoses fled to Hawaii in 2 planes flown in from the military base in Pampanga when they fled to Hawaii in exile. The Marcos saga would continue after they reached Hawaii because Marcos and his loyalists continued to destabilize the newly formed Aquino government back in the Philippines. His followers and loyalists, most of whom belonged to the military establishment, continued to be in close contact with the Marcoses, and several attempts were masterminded by Marcoses' top aides and supporters like Juan Ponce and Enrile to make trouble for the newly established administration after the Marcos regime was toppled. Now, understanding the Marcos plunder is the next section of my presentation. And to fully appreciate the dynamics of the world-class plunder that Ferdinand Marcos perpetrated in the Philippines for more than 2 decades, it is necessary to understand the complex transnational network and establishment of quote-unquote hot money, sophisticated banking technology, and international white-collar crime in which is operated. This means that the plunder could not have existed in a vacuum, correct? This section is derived mostly from a chapter of my monograph, The Transnational Dynamics of the Marcos Plunder, in which I argued that it would not have been possible for the Marcos clique to steal upwards of $10 billion without the active support and complicity of global financial institutions that specialize in massive money laundering operations through elaborate mechanisms such as offshore tax havens, shell companies, dummy corporations, secret coded bank accounts, and layers of nominees or trustees to conceal the real status or identities of the Marcos whole secret account holders. An author by the name of R.T. Naylor calls these mechanisms the, quote, instruments of modern peekaboo finance, unquote, which originally emerged to handle the financial needs of a select group of covert operators, from the ultra-rich tax evaders in the world to drug dealers to service agents against agents in their ilk. Eventually, Naylor continues, the methods of peekaboo finance expanded this select group beyond the select group and became accessible to the service of all, regardless of race, color, creed, political affiliation, regardless of income level. They would be increasingly used by the corrupt dictatorships or regimes in the third world, which had become commonplace in the post-war or pre-colonial era. By 1966, the United States had become the second, note this, the second, next only to Switzerland, the major capital flight center in the world. The underworld empire of organized crime, popularly known as the mafia or the mob, created a system that was virtually impervious to regulation by fiscal or monetary authorities. In 1931, however, the U.S. International Service, the IRS, succeeded in obtaining a conviction of Al Capone for tax evasion. Everybody knew this gangster of gangsters. Here was a man who was reported as having murdered so many people and brutally victimized his opponents, and the IRS and the government could only get him for tax evasion. My goodness. Later on, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky broke away from the mafia leadership to engage in previously banned heroin trade. A new international era of international crime markets and underground economies had begun. From then on, mob money was siphoned off to overseas havens, such as syndicates running illegal emporiums in places like New Orleans. Likewise, at this time, Asia, particularly the free port of Hong Kong, was becoming profitable and attractive as tax havens for money laundered by dictators, military generals, and crime syndicates involved in smuggling, drugs, prostitution, gun running, and other forms of criminality. These activities would be expanded by the post-World War II emergence of the Euro market, and the US became the most economically productive country in the world. It was relatively easy to convert criminal cash, let's call it that way, into ranches in Australia, skyscrapers in New York, estates in New Jersey, and condominiums in London. In the old days, it was far more difficult to transport hot or stolen monies because you had to stuff them in cumbersome suitcases that customs inspectors could easily open and confiscate. In the new system, in the new technology of banking internationally, you can just deposit or withdraw monies and funds at the push of a button. New banking technology made it easier to move criminal monies around the world. Historically, and this is where I thought maybe Dr. Churchill and myself would be talking about this new system in quotation marks, was really not new in the sense that the concept of a transnational heaven was easy to access in churches and cathedrals. These are groups run by religious orders. The concept was just being resurrected in modern times of peekaboo finance and transnational tax havens. So there's a long history to this kind of thing also, to launder and create all these tax havens to evade taxes, basically. In effect, these modern overseas companies offer the best incentives for investments in terms of confidentiality, secrecy of identities of account holders, freedom from regulation and supervision by higher authorities, and most of all, the absence of any kind of audit or investigation. Where else could Marcos and his clique deposit their loot and stolen monies? The field was wide open. It was the best of times for them. As early as 1962, Bernie Cornfield established the biggest mutual fund called Investors Overseas Service, or IOS. How much more convenient for Marcos stolen monies, and what better place to deposit them than in the IOS set up by Bernie Cornfield. Switzerland, as usual, became the most attractive and profitable haven for all kinds of stolen or hot monies around the world. The next section of my paper is called Marcos Unmasked. It came as no surprise that as early as 1968, Marcos, towards the end of his second and last term as president, He and his wife had already opened 4 accounts in Swiss banks using the pseudonyms of William Saunders for Ferdinand Marcos and Jen Ryan for Imelda Marcos. I was in Hawaii at this time, and there was a real William Saunders, who was a lawyer living in Hawaii, who went to court to file a lawsuit by using his name as one of the launderers and of stolen monies. How then could it be possible when Marcos' salary then as president of the Philippines was only 60,000 pesos, which was equivalent to only $2,000 at the time? That's yearly salary. People, of course, knew the answer or answers, from stealing to looting to tax evasion and other criminal ways using the convenient tax havens that had proliferated this time. The initial deposit, Marcos and Imelda, of 1 million grew into hundreds of millions, especially after Marcos declared martial law in 1973. By the stroke of a pen, Marcos had made it easier to steal and sold more money and resources away from the Philippines. He and his followers milked or bilked major sectors of the economy, extorted from business establishments or enterprises wanting to do business in the Philippines. They established phony companies, borrowed from banks without collateral, and siphoned off vital capital funds to overseas destinations. But times did not remain at a standstill. The endless bilking and milking of the economy began to erode and undermine the supposed stability of the Philippines until it slowly collapsed. The Marcos regime was beginning to fall apart, and it did in early 1986. Now, the burden of recovering as much as possible of the Marcos loot, or hidden wealth, quote unquote, as it was called, fell on the PCGG, this Philippine Commission on Good Government, under the able leadership of its chairman, former Senator Jovito R. Salonga. Salonga and his staff traveled to Switzerland to request the Swiss banks to open the Marcos secret accounts and return the stolen monies to the Philippines and other sources when they were in power. The Philippine Senate, through the Blue Ribbon Committee, revealed the accession of, get this, 97 alleged accounts of the late Marcos in 23 banks in Europe, the US, and Asia. The accounts were held by exotically named foundations like Spinus Foundation and plain-sounding ones like Category CAR. About 23 of these banks were located in Switzerland, such as Swiss Credit Banks, Swiss Bank Corporation, Standard Bank, and Bank Hopan AG. The ease with which Marcos and his cronies maintained secret accounts in Switzerland is living proof of the ready availability and complicity of financial institutions internationally and banks to keep and protect laundered funds from all sources in the world. As one author put it, the inventive capacity of humans is considerable. A nominee, attorney A, buys the use of a series numbered of accounts from Bank B. A nominee, attorney C, representing concealment-prone corporation D, negotiates with Bank A for the use of the numbered accounts, and so on. All these were cleverly used by Marcos to his advantage. Unfortunately, Chairman Salonga resigned from PCGG to run for the Philippine Senate, and the recovery of the hidden wealth could still be going on. It has been an extremely difficult job because hidden wealth was not only deposited in Swiss banks, but also in other offshore banks from other parts of the country and Caribbean and Asia. The initial return of $500 million to the Philippines was a breakthrough in this endless search. There are still properties being sequestered in the Philippines that need to be resolved. Now, sequestration is a term that is used to taking and holding of property pending resolution of a legal dispute for confiscation of property by government action. But, you know, some of these cronies were able to buy themselves out, hired clever lawyers, talented lawyers to argue their cases in court, and you compare that to the lack of lawyers in the PCGG itself, which was very disappointing. By 1987, PCGG had sequestered 260 companies, and this has been going on for many years. And by way of conclusion, I'm ending this presentation by trying to broaden and deepen our understanding of the colossal plunder of the Marcoses perpetrated in the Philippines by probing its transnational dimensions. It is a mind-numbing phenomenon that profoundly shocked even the most hard-boiled critics or cynics. It earned for Marcos such opprobrium as, quote, the world's biggest thief, quote, one of the world's leaders, and another perpetrator of the plunder of the ages. Several years after Marcos declared martial law, and many years after his death, Philippine society continues to grapple with the pernicious effects of his assault against its very core. While the plundered was more nurtured by Marcos' psyche of greed and obsession of power, it is important to put this in the context of certain global realities, which made it easier to steal across national borders and provided more opportunities for corruption for the already corrupt Marcoses. These realities included the ever-increasing pool of hot money, as I mentioned earlier, generated by the transnational drug trade, smuggling, gambling, extortion, bribery, and other criminal or illegal activities. Also, by the emergence of laundering mechanisms for stolen monies, like multinational banks and offshore havens, which offered secrecy accounts and freedom from any kind of audit, and the internationalization of white-collar crime and corporate fraud. The flight of money from the third world countries under repressive regimes was accelerated by the state-of-the-art banking technology that the electronic revolution, which made it remarkably easy to wire accounts overseas or transfer them anywhere at the mere press of a button. The amazing thing is that these overseas havens, while noted for their reputation as criminal markets, actually operated with a mantle of legitimacy provided by an autonomous municipal status that gives them the legal ability to conduct overseas business, as we have seen during the Marcos era. The continuing support of the US administrations, accompanied by massive doses of assistance to the regime, contributed immensely to a continued systematic looting of the Philippines by Marcos and his cronies. American policymakers did not want to jeopardize the existence of the US military bases in the Philippines, which were in the form of the American defense position in Asia and the Pacific. The bulk of the Marcos' ill-gotten wealth is spread throughout various offshore havens in the US, Europe, Caribbean, Asia, and other parts of the world. Some could be hidden in Africa and Australia as well. The Philippines has concentrated its search in Switzerland, but tremendous assets could be well hidden in Austria, Liechtenstein, the Bahamas, and Hong Kong and other places. The $500 million that the Swiss authorities have returned to the Philippines was the first substantial break in recovery efforts by the Marcos groups, various groups in the country. But as you can see, in terms of the amount, gargantuan amounts stolen by the Marcoses and the cronies, 500 million was just a, what you call, peanuts. Much still needs to be done at this writing, and there are no details because the PCGG was having its own troubles, but we have to thank Professor Abinales of University of Hawaii for updating us on the various recoveries that have been made, and this will continue to happen, hopefully, and the Marcos loop will finally be resolved at one point, no matter how long it takes. Thank you very much. And I have other details to tell you. And we are thankful to Professor Jojo Abinales for having given us some more details on how much the PCGG has recovered. Unfortunately, it has slowed down because, as I said earlier, they lack the lawyers to argue their cases. And these are people, the Marcoses, the Marcos cronies and others who still have a lot of money. That's why they're still around on, in Philippine politics with the Marcoses, Imelda, Bongbong, and Aimee, all having government positions. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. And I have to cut short because, as I said, it's running over the time. Thank you so much. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat from Hawaii.
Maraming salamat po, Dr. Lindy Aquino. Grabe no, sobrang alam naman natin na nagnakaw talaga ng kaban ng bayan si Marcos. Pero pag nakikita natin yung detalye, yung extent ng ninakaw niya, talagang
Garapal, Garapal.
Garapal, grabe po.
Garapal. Yes, term for it. Yeah.
Grabe. So maraming salamat po ulit, Professor Lindy Aquino, sa inyong napaka-komprehensibo at enlightening na exposition ng mga nangyayaring pagnanakaw ni Marcos sa kaban ng bayan. At magandang inote natin yung mga na-cite ni Professor Lindy na mga sources ng data niya, ng mga impormasyon like yung 2,000 documents, bank records, contacts, personal communications, mga Marcos papers na tinatawag. At actually, maaari natin itong gamitin para isagot sa mga nakakausap nating nagsasabi na wala daw ebidensya to. Diba, ang daming nagsasabi nito. At nakita naman natin kung paano nakapasok ang kanyang pagnanakaw sa Guinness Book of World Records na nasa category ng greatest robbery of a government. So grabe. So ipagpatuloy natin ang diskusyon na to. Ngayon naman kasama natin si Attorney Ruben Carranza na nakapagtapos ng BA at LLB sa University of the Philippines at LLM naman sa New York University noong 2005 bilang isang Global Public Service Law Program Scholar. So siya ay kasalukuyang nagtatrabaho kasama ng mga biktima or mga victims, communities, and reparations policymakers sa iba't ibang bansa tulad ng Nepal, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, Pilipinas, Iraq, Palestine, Liberia, Ghana, South Africa, and Kenya. At siya rin ay nagbibigay ng mga advice sa mga issue na may kinalaman sa reparations at war crime tribunals, kasama nandyan yung Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia or ECCC at International Criminal Court or ICC. At mula noong 2001 hanggang 2004, nagsilbi siya bilang isang commissioner sa Presidential Commission on Good Governance or PCGG. So may mabibigay sa sa ating mga updated of course na mga data about this sa ating topic. At sila yung namahala sa litigasyon at investigasyon na nakapag-recover ng mahigit na 680 million US dollars worth na ill-gotten assets ng pamilya ni Ferdinand Marcos na itinago sa mga bangko sa Switzerland gaya ng mga kwento ni Dr. Lindy kanina, sa US at iba pang mga bansa. Siya rin ay nakapagsilbi sa UN Ad Hoc Committee na nakapagsulat ng 2003 UN Convention Against Corruption. Ayan, so nakapagtrabaho siya kasama ng civil society on proposed reparations measures para sa mga biktima ng diktadurang Marcos at naging legal counsel ng mga pamilya ng mga desaparecidos, mga dating bilanggong politikal at iba pang mga grupo ng mga biktima. Kaya ngayon, pakinggan na natin si Attorney Ruben Carranza. Attorney?
Magandang hapon, ba? O umaga pa lang dyan.
Umaga pa rin po.
At isang special na pagbati kay Professor Aquino. Si Professor Aquino was an official of the university when I was collegian editor many years ago. And I worked a lot with Professor Lindy and I still have great admiration for her work and her commitment. And I'm glad that she laid out much of the history of corruption and ill-gotten wealth and the concealing of that ill-gotten wealth during the Marcos dictatorship. That will let me go more quickly to what I would focus on. And what I would like to focus on is the, let me just go to, what I would like to focus on is the ways through which we, and by we, not just the PCGG, but the Filipino people, the Republic of the Philippines, have both recovered and won against the Marcos family, the ways by which we have lost to the Marcos family and their cronies, and how we can still win against them. And dahil uso ngayon sa Pilipinas yung salitang enabler in another context, I will also say a little bit about those who have enabled the Marcos dictatorship, including in the University of the Philippines, or as well as alumni of the university, and what they can do about dealing with the past. I'll start by pointing out what else happened on September 21, 1972. And I pasted this excerpt from an April 2012 Supreme Court decision written by former Chief Justice Meilu Sereno, my good friend and former co-faculty member in the College of Law in UP. This was both a footnote and then partially quoted in the body of the decision. The decision involved assets of a company called Arelma, and I will go into Arelma in a moment. But let me read this. Found among Malacanang documents when the Marcos family fled in 1986 is a letter dated September 21, 1972 by J.L. Sunier, Senior Vice President of SBC, to Mr. Jose V. Campos, a known Marcos crony. Now, let me stop there and just spell out who J.L. Sunier is. Jean-Louis Sunier was a former Vice President of SBC, Swiss Banking Corporation, at that point, the third largest bank in Switzerland. And so this letter is a letter from him to Mr. Jose V. Campos, a known Marcos crony and one of the fund managers of Marcos in the Philippines. The letter was dated September 21, 1972. And in the letter, as quoted by the Supreme Court, instructions were given by Sunier to their Panama office to constitute a Panamanian company, the name of which will either be La Rema, Arelma, or Relma. Now, let me pause here and tell you something about setting up a company in Panama. You don't need to do a lot to set up a company in Panama. As a matter of fact, you only need one person, not two, not three, not four, not five, to set up a Panamanian company. the beauty or the evil, depending on how you look at it, of establishing a company in Panama is that you need not even own the company. You can just hire a lawyer in Panama and ask that lawyer to represent you as the owner of the company, and then an agreement between you and the lawyer can be entered into showing who the real owner is. That's what Jean-Louis Saunier was telling Marcos that he would do in Panama through his office on September 21st, 1972. In the end, Saunier decided to name the company Arelma. Saunier then directed, and I'm reading again, the opening of direct account in the name of the new company with Merrill Lynch. Merrill Lynch is a private banking company in New York, giving them authority to operate the Arelma account, but excluding withdrawals of cash, securities, or pledging of portfolio, and the sending of money in favor of the new company under reference Azur to cut links with the present account already opened with Merrill Lynch under an individual's name. They did not say who that individual is. That individual is Ferdinand Marcos. So aside from declaring martial law on September 21, 1972, Ferdinand Marcos actually opened a bank account in the name of Arelma, a Panamanian company in Switzerland, opened a bank account, and then transferred money from the Swiss bank account of Arelma to a bank account in New York, also in the name of Arelma. And as Lindy mentioned earlier, even before martial law was declared, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos were already laundering money from corruption using the aliases William Saunders and Jane Ryan as early as 1968. In the first term of Ferdinand Marcos as president, he became president in 1965, and therefore before he declared martial law, he already opened a number of Swiss bank accounts. This one is in Swiss Credit Bank, SCB, which eventually merged with what is now UBS, biggest bank in Switzerland. So aside from SBC, you have SCB and several other Swiss banks in which William Saunders and Jane Ryan, Ferdinand Marcos, and Imelda Marcos had Swiss accounts. Who were the enablers of the corruption of the dictatorship? The generals who benefited financially from martial law, and some of them are still alive up to now. The cronies who controlled monopolies in agriculture and industry in the Philippines. One such crony, for example, Roberto Benedicto, controlled the sugar monopoly in the Philippines, controlled the sugar mills, controlled the sugar refining and exporting industry, and even had the assets because of the monopoly he controlled to take over a TV station, Banahaw Broadcasting Corporation. Some of you listening here may be old enough to remember that BBC, Banahaw Broadcasting, which used to be, at that point, ABS-CBN. But he took over, it became Banahaw Broadcasting Company. And this is not trivia, this is to show the extent to which Marcos cronies and their corruption reached. One of those who sang the jingle, the station music for Banahaw Broadcasting Company, was from a family of sugar millers close to the Roberto Benedicto monopoly. The name of that family and the head of that family, Jose Marichan. Who else enabled the dictatorship's corruption? Global North government and corporations who benefited from the neoliberal economic policies of the dictatorship. I'll give you an example in a moment. Another enabler is the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, who continued to lend funds to the dictatorship, knowing its human rights record and its record of corruption. And of course, one of the key enablers, Swiss banks and other banks who kept the ill-gotten wealth of the Marcoses and their cronies. So this is from a Free Press editorial cartoon during the dictatorship. You can see there that Marcos and his oligarchs were supporting the repression of other oligarchs in government. So you can already hear again this rhetoric about oligarchs. This will sound familiar to those paying attention to what the current president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, often says. He says he's going after oligarchs. That's not new, that's not novel, that's something that Marcos did. But the biggest crony in terms of assets, in terms of money collected from the dictatorship through corruption, is probably the crony who controlled the Coconut Levy Fund. He was able to purchase and acquire United Coconut Planters Bank, and he was able to acquire the single biggest corporation in the Philippines up to now, San Miguel Corporation. And an important point here is that many Filipinos, especially in the media, among business people, and even among the Philippine elite more generally, continue to regard those who still control the crony-acquired San Miguel Corporation's leadership as if they were not implicated in Marcos' dictatorship, cronyism, and corruption. They call someone who heads the company a taipan, a successful businessman. They praise him as if the investment that he claims to have had in San Miguel Corporation did not come from funds stolen from millions of poor Filipino coconut farmers. So in a way, some of you might actually be enabling corruption by continuing to look at those who benefited from Marcos' dictatorship corruption as if they were innocent, as if they were never involved, as if they did not profit from their complicity. Who else are enablers? The World Bank. In 1973, the president of the World Bank, Robert McNamara, who was formerly defense secretary, who presided over the U.S. occupation of Vietnam, he became World Bank president. And when he was told that Ferdinand Marcos had proclaimed martial law in 1972, he said, it's a miracle. We must support it. And so the World Bank and the IMF not only continued to provide loans to the Marcos dictatorship, their so-called seal of approval then let foreign corporations invest in the Philippines and feed and enable the corruption of the Marcos dictatorship. So, and those assets, of course, went to Switzerland and other foreign banks. Now, an example of how foreign corporations and a Marcos crony benefited from corruption during the dictatorship is the example of the Bataan nuclear power plant, a 2.2 billion nuclear power plant that has never operated. Initially, Herminio Dicini obtained 18 million in bribes from Westinghouse, who eventually won the contract to build the mothballed nuclear power plant. Herminio Dicini is the husband of a cousin of Imelda Marcos, Paz Dicini. And Herminio Dicini presided over the contractual process that led to the building of the nuclear power plant. Westinghouse got away, got paid, and was never charged, was never held accountable for its complicity and enabling of corruption during the Marcos dictatorship. It took a while, but the civil cases that were filed against Herminio Dicini were stuck when I joined the PCGG in 2001. And we then had to work hard to make the cases, to resurrect the cases, make them move forward. Some of the obstacles to making the cases against Herminio Dicini move forward involved the actions of the former ombudsman of the Philippines, Aniano Desierto, who kept claiming that there was not enough evidence to move forward with the criminal cases, and who then dismissed those cases, and they had to constantly be appealed to the Supreme Court. That's the criminal case part. On the other hand, the civil cases, the cases to recover ill-gotten assets from Herminio Dicini, could not move forward because Herminio Dicini could not be served summons from the Sandigan Bayan. Why? Because he was in Austria enjoying a royal title that he purchased with ill-gotten money. What did we do? We tried and were able to get the help of Philippine immigration officials to tell us when Herminio Dicini would often be back in the Philippines. And on one occasion, when he was playing golf in Pasig, I was able to assemble a group of process servers and police. And finally, we served summons on Herminio Dicini while he was in the middle of the golf course. And that led to the case moving forward. Herminio Dicini, unfortunately for the PCGG and the Filipino people, died before the criminal case could move forward. That meant the criminal case had to be dismissed. But the civil case for recovering ill-gotten wealth survived the death of Marcos Cronies. And so last year, eventually, after decades of litigation, the Supreme Court awarded 1 billion to the Republic of the Philippines against the estate of Herminio Dicini over corruption involving the Bataan nuclear power plant. And a few months ago, I was asked what can be done still involving Herminio Dicini. I said that the PCGG and the Republic of the Philippines can still go after the heirs of Herminio Dicini to collect the 1 billion that the Supreme Court's decision says should be recovered from the heirs of Herminio Dicini. These are people who go on the cover of glossy Philippine magazines, who organize these fancy parties in the Philippines. They have assets. The Philippines can collect them. So the Arelma case, and I'll focus on that, shows how the Marcoses committed corruption and how Filipinos can still win against them. So I already told you the story that Jean-Louis Saunier opened a Swiss bank account and established a Panamanian corporation on September 21st, 1972. Ferdinand Marcos then transferred 2 million in ill-gotten funds to that Swiss bank account in the name of Arelma. And then he then instructed Saunier to transfer that 2 million to a bank account, again in the name of Arelma, in Merrill Lynch in New York. After the dictatorship fell in 1986, the PCGG asked the Swiss government for help in finding Marcos accounts based on documents that were mostly found in Malacanang. And one of those documents is the September 21st letter of Saunier. Based on the request of the PCGG, Switzerland found and froze several Swiss assets of 14 known entities created by Marcos to his Swiss bankers. Now, note that I use the term entities. In the past, many journalists and government officials in the Philippines would often use the term foundation, that Imelda Marcos set up a foundation in Switzerland. And I think it's important to correct that use of the term because foundation connotes a charitable purpose and an entity that's non-profit. There's no such thing, at least not in this case. They were for-profit entities meant to hide ill-gotten wealth. One of the set of documents that was transferred to the PCGG by the Swiss government was a set of documents that further expanded on what we knew about Arelma. We knew that Marcos had created an Arelma entity. We did not know that he had deposited 2 million at that point, and we did not know what happened to this deposit in Merrill Lynch. When the Swiss turned over the documents sometime in 2000, before I joined the PCGG, that was the first time the PCGG learned about Arelma's assets. And so when I joined the PCGG in 2001, some commissioners, one commissioner particularly, went to Panama to take over Arelma and take possession of its ownership documents. This commissioner is now the Chief Justice of the Philippine Supreme Court, Alexander Resmundo. The PCGG then asked Merrill Lynch to turn over Arelma's assets, and using a 2003 Supreme Court decision, which I will talk about next, the decision that said all assets of the Marcoses exceeding their legitimate income are ill-gotten, the PCGG obtained a decision in 2012, long after I left the commission, that said Arelma's assets are ill-gotten and should go back to the Philippines. But take note that Arelma's assets were in New York, in Merrill Lynch, and there's now litigation over those assets that the US government is supporting so that it can go back to the Philippines. Now, the Arelma process that I illustrated shows what the needs and the challenges are to winning against the Marcoses, winning some more and winning again. It's important that an asset recovery commission such as the PCGG continue to exist but it must be independent. Right now, the PCGG is attached to the Department of Justice. And so that says a lot about whether it's independent and whether it can be independent. That commission must have competence in the fields of forensic accounting, banking, and for a long time, until after the Salonga Commission, it did not have knowledge of Philippine history. Most of the commissioners were simply persons who were happy to negotiate with the Marcoses and enter into compromises, but never contextualized their work and the litigation that they were leading in the context of the history of the dictatorship. The Office of the Solicitor General and the Special Prosecutor of the Sandigan Bayan must rely on that competence. Fourth, the claims of the Marcos victims were respected, and I led in the process of drafting a reparations law for victims of the Marcos dictatorship that would be funded by the recovery of assets of the Marcos family, which happened in 2003 when the Supreme Court ruled in the forfeiture case that we filed that all assets of the Marcoses exceeding their lawful income as president and as former governor of Metro Manila is ill-gotten. So on July 15, 2003, the Supreme Court ruled that the 658 million that was recovered and identified in Switzerland, this should be 685 million, not 658. It's part of the assets that should be forfeited in favor of the Republic because it exceeds the legitimate income of the Marcos spouses. How did we recover the 685 billion from Marcos Swiss accounts? First, the commission insisted to Switzerland that Switzerland should accept a civil case judgment instead of the former requirement of a final criminal conviction. Why was this important? It was impossible to convict a dead dictator. It was also becoming very difficult to convict Imelda Marcos given the delays that had already happened and the deliberate tactic of delaying the criminal process that she was adopting and her lawyers were resorting to. We worked with the then Solicitor General and later the Ombudsman, Simeon Marcelo, to move the civil case for forfeiture, civil case 141 forward, and that became the decision of the Supreme Court in 2003, the 685 million. Now, that was not the end of the story because now I had to bring that decision to Switzerland. So I went to Switzerland a couple of times to negotiate for the actual return of the money to the Philippine government. In Switzerland, I faced a dilemma. It was important in my mind to ask the Swiss government to officially send a decision saying, number one, that these assets were ill-gotten, and that number two, they were being returned to the Philippines on the premise that they were ill-gotten. It was important to have this contained in an official decision of the Ministry of Justice so that we can use that decision as a precedent for future asset recoveries in Switzerland. The Swiss did not want to do that. Instead, they offered to issue a press release. A press release is a press release. It's news that will be reported and then published, but it does not bind a state. It does not bind the Swiss government. It will not bind Swiss banks. The dilemma was, if I insisted on an official decision, it would take longer to negotiate, and it might also possibly not be given by Switzerland. So you will see, if you go on the website of the Department of Justice and Police in Switzerland, you will see what I decided to ask for, this press release. At the same time, I thought it was important to make the 2003 decision of the Philippine Supreme Court even stronger and more strategic. Remember that the 2003 decision says that all assets exceeding the approximately $300,000, more or less, that the Marcos spouses would be considered to have as their legitimate income, assets exceeding that would be ill-gotten. But it was so far only applied to the $685 million in Swiss bank deposits that we recovered. One of the last legal steps I took as PCGG commissioner before I left was to direct the filing of several motions for partial summary judgment invoking the 2003 decision across all pending civil cases to recover assets from the Marcoses. So this one is the last motion I signed as commissioner, and this was filed in the Arelma case. This is what led to the 2012 decision declaring Arelma assets to be ill-gotten and belonging to the Philippines, and to that quotation that I started with involving what else the Marcoses did on September 21, 1972. Now, what do the Marcoses have to say about these recoveries? Of course, you have Amy Marcos suggesting in the middle of the pandemic that the government of the Philippines find more sources of funding to aid the poor, she said, to avoid any problems because of the lockdowns going on in the pandemic. So that's one Marcos saying that there should be more money for the poor instead of more money coming from them, the recovery. Now, it's important to note how much these assets could actually fund if they were recovered. Now, this is from the jewelry collection that's already been recovered by the Philippines, again, based on the 2003 decision of the Supreme Court. If these jewelry seized by the Philippines were sold, they could fund the immunization and vaccination for 20,000 children and 17,000 senior citizens and infants in the Philippines. Just this diamond alone could fund 2 regional airports in the Philippines, and this is all from PCGG data. It's important to link asset recovery to the work that I do right now, which is transitional justice. And so one of the steps I took, again, before I left the commission, was to draft a bill to provide reparations for victims of the Marcos dictatorship. The bill, which eventually was signed as a law by former President Benigno Aquino, set aside 200 million from the 685 million we recovered from Switzerland. So that money has been distributed to several victims, some of them receiving 25,000 to as large as 1.76 million in compensation. 10 million from that 200 million set aside is now funding a museum that is being set up in UP Diliman. I have not seen this, but I'm sure some of you have seen construction that might be going on. And it will help in other measures to recognize victims of the Marcos dictatorship. Now, Imelda Marcos was convicted in 2018. And some of you always ask, what happens next? Will she go to jail? By way of answering the question, let me go back to a 1996 Philippine Supreme Court decision that affirmed an earlier conviction of Imelda Marcos at the Sandigan Bayan for corruption involving property of the Light Rail Transit Authority. In 1996, the Supreme Court affirmed the Sandigan Bayan conviction of Imelda Marcos. Imelda filed a motion for reconsideration. The Supreme Court denied her motion for reconsideration. Her lawyer filed a second motion for reconsideration, which lawyers know ought to be rejected right away, but for some reason, her lawyer was able to ask the entire court, instead of just the division in which that motion was filed, to rule on that second motion for reconsideration. 5 years later, while the motion was still pending, a new Solicitor General joined the lawyer of Imelda in moving for her acquittal. Is this unusual? Yes, it's very unusual because the OSG is normally not involved in prosecuting criminal cases. What happened? Imelda was acquitted. The Supreme Court said she was innocent, and so Imelda has avoided jail. The Solicitor General who joined the lawyer of Imelda, his name was Romeo de la Cruz, and this is what former Senator Rene Saguisag had to say about him. He is one of the voice of former Solicitor General and Marcos Justice Minister Estelito Mendoza, and the snicker or wink factor will be there, and that passes for the administration of justice in our benighted country. Estelito Mendoza in a speech 3 years ago during the centennial of Ferdinand Marcos's birth in Ilocos Norte, defended Ferdinand Marcos and his dictatorship. He said that Marcos served the Philippines selflessly. And of course, this is what other persons associated with Ferdinand Marcos have been doing. In the College of Law, for example, there is a Juan Ponce Enrile room, if I'm not mistaken. It was inaugurated. And so you can see the inauguration picture there, together with where Juan Ponce Enrile was on September 23, 1972, sitting there with the general who formed the military junta of the Marcos dictatorship. How is this possible when we say never forget, and yet we allow someone like Juan Ponce Enrile or someone like Estelito Mendoza to be honored in the university itself? There it is. Estelito Mendoza inaugurating the UP Law Library in the Bonifacio, in the BGC campus of the College of Law. I've never been there, but apparently Estelito Mendoza was there to inaugurate something, the defender of the Marcos dictatorship inaugurating a law library of UP. How's that possible if we say never forget? So what do UP alumni owe the people? They owe the people the truth of what they know about the Marcos family's abuses. If they were part of the Marcos dictatorship, if they sat as Solicitor General or Defense Minister, or even as a member of parliament representing the youth sector during the Marcos dictatorship, then they should talk about the truth. Number two, they should acknowledge that role. If they benefited from the Marcos dictatorship, whether financially or not, they should acknowledge how they benefited. And perhaps more importantly, an apology, an individual personal apology for the role they played during the Marcos dictatorship and for enabling the continued impunity of the Marcoses. I don't think organizing a forum about martial law as UP, as the institution, is the same thing as an individual acknowledgement by the leadership of the university who might have enabled the dictatorship, who might have been even complicit in the abuses of the dictatorship. And I think this is important, because without this acknowledgement, without taking never again and never forget seriously, you have the rise, the re-emergence of authoritarian populist leaders. And you have the Marcoses benefiting from the rise of those authoritarian leaders. But here's something to hope for. The dictators who die, who are buried as heroes, can be exhumed. Here's a picture of Imelda Marcos sitting next to Augusto Pinochet. Where were they? They were attending the funeral of Francisco Franco, who was then to be buried in a hero's grave in Spain. Decades later, actually last year, Francisco Franco's heroic body was exhumed and removed from that hero's burial setting. Imelda Marcos, Augusto Pinochet, Francisco Franco, dictators can be buried as heroes, the lie can be foisted, but the lie can be exhumed and the lie can be corrected. Because the past, and this is a quote from an historian in Chile, the past does not go away. So let me end there. Thank you very much.
Ayan, so maraming salamat po, Attorney Karan, sa isang napakagaling at napaka-extensibong discussion tungkol sa napakasalimuot na proseso ng pagbawi natin ng mga nanakaw ni Marcos na pera mula sa Kaban ng Bayan. Ang hirap-hirap talaga, lalo na kapag ang mga nakaupo sa pwesto ay may pagkiling sa pamilyang to. Kaya sa mga naghirap at tag-effort upang gawin to, tulad ninyo, Attorney Carranza, at mga dati at kasalukuyang commissioners ng PCGG, mabuhay po kayong lahat. Ayan, so may nagkomento sa ating chat box, dapat po na isalin sa wikang Pilipino ang lahat ng ito para maintindihan ng karamihan sa ating mga kababayan na hindi nakakaintindi ng wika maigi sa wikang Ingles, which is true. So bukod pa riyan, sana maganda rin itong isalin sa iba pang mga forms of popular content like TikTok posts, FB videos, infographics, para mas marami tayong maabot sa ating advokasya ng pagbibigay linaw sa mga mito na ito ukol sa diktadurang Marcos kasama na nga yung kanyang mga ninakaw. Yan, so kung may mga katanungan po tayo sa ating mga naging speaker, mga naunang dalawang naging speaker, sasagutin natin yan pagkatapos ng lahat ng tagapagsalita. Ilagay nyo lang po sa Q&A box or chat box ang inyong mga katanungan para ma-address natin sila mamaya. So ngayon, susunod na tagapagsalita ay si Professor Ronald Mendoza mula sa Ateneo School of Government ng, of course, Ateneo de Manila University. Ang kanyang presentasyon na pinamagatang Lessons Learned from Marcos' Crony Capitalism ay naglalayong bigyang liwanag ang mga dapat nating mapagtantong aral at katotohanan bilang mga individual at bilang isang lipunan mula sa mga tinatawag na crony capitalism noong panahon ng diktadurang Marcos at medyo nakikita nga natin sa panahon ngayon. Ating kilalanin muna si Professor Mendoza. So Dr. Mendoza has an extensive background in international development policy and international cooperation with a resume that includes work with the United Nations, the Asian Institute of Management, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So si Dr. Mendoza, he has collaborated with government officials, academics, and representatives of the private and non-profit sectors to advance reforms that could improve human development, reduce poverty, and elicit more inclusive economic and political development. So marami na siyang na-carry out na research at technical assistance engagement sa iba't ibang bansa tulad ng Ethiopia, Mongolia, Senegal, Thailand, Turkey, Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine, and so on. At para sa talk na ito tungkol sa crony capitalism, let us all welcome Professor Ronald Mendoza. Professor Mendoza.
Magandang umaga po. I am Ron Mendoza, Dean and Professor of Economic Development at the Ateneo School of Government. My talk today is about cronyism and oligarchic behavior. Cronyism and oligarchic behavior thrives as long as governance systems and institutions remain weak and reforms have yet to be implemented. A market economy with strong competition and a level playing field, and a political system with genuine accountability and less dominated by fat dynasties are among the continuing reform aspirations to further strengthen our democracy and our economic development as a country. This presentation today draws on a discussion about Marcos-era cronyism, juxtaposed against the types of bad governance and corruption that we see today in the Philippines. And it is drawing on a corruption research documented by Rick Manapat in his book, Some Are Smarter Than Others, recently republished by Ateneo Press. My responses draw on my research on governance and anti-corruption, which were done with the AIM Policy Center and the Ateneo Policy Center. I hope these are useful for your discussions as we try to move our country forward towards better governance. Thank you.
By definition, the fall of a dictator should actually suggest that there is no single monopoly of power anymore. And so now I think is the more nuanced interpretation of what is happening to us. In fact, I would like to refer to a narrative shared by my good friend, Attorney Alex Lacson, who said that we were able to kick a dictator out of Malacanang, but we are unable to kick the many mini dictators in each of the provinces. And these mini dictators are actually the political clans, right? It's a nuanced interpretation of what's happening to us. We decentralize in a way some of the power. It ended up in some of our regions, in our provinces. But those provinces within their borders got quickly captured by very powerful families. And they are being contested by very powerful families. Not by powerful ideas, not by powerful reforms, not by credible political parties. They are being contested by powerful individuals and powerful families. So the system of governance actually is built around this contest. And this contest is not necessarily producing the inclusive economic development that we all want, nor the good governance that we all want. And certainly it's not producing citizens' empowerment. So it's important to say that these many mini dictators who are out there in the country And they're seen in cities, they're seen in the countryside. The degree to which you can push back on them tempers their impunity. Our interpretation is that if you're in a city with an Ateneo, with the LaSalle, with the UP, with the UST, with the UE, with an FEU, these powerful individuals cannot just practice impunity. If you have media, if you have Rappler, well, we used to have ABS-CBN, not anymore. That's actually troubling. But if you have these institutions that can push back, you have business, you have church groups, you have civil society, then even though they have concentrated some power, they cannot practice the impunity that could be practiced in places like Maguindanao or Lanao del Sur or Sulu. And there, where you don't have the pushback, where you don't have the checks that we may have in the cities, in the more developed areas, where we have maybe the bigger middle class, then the risk of impunity is very, very high. So I think it's important to understand that it goes in layers. First is the concentration of power in a few political families. Then there is the absence of that democratic pushback. Then there is the opportunity for impunity that occurs. Now, the other side of the story, of course, is that you actually took out a dictator in Malacanang, but there are still powers in the presidency that actually help create some of the very bad relationships that we see, the bad governance that we see. And that's I'm referring to here is the pork barrel relationship that actually holds Congress back, which is why every Congress and every president tends to be bound together in this. Well, essentially, it's a mutually enforcing behavior where the president needs all of Congress in order to get all that power, and Congress cannot really practice its oversight role because it needs the money and the resources. So that's the kind of bad governance and bad equilibrium that we have right now that we hope through institutional reforms, through ideas like deep decentralization, dare I say federalism, but the right kind, not the bogus kind, we're actually envisioning rebalancing that power so that not everything is in the center. You actually have some agility in the local governments, but at the same time, with that agility, with those resources, must come accountability. So we must be able to hold them accountable also to what they're going to do with that additional power from the center. Well, I think that's essentially the innovation of every democracy that lasts. And that's the difference between a country that remains less developed and not really a rich and powerful country, and those that eventually make it to becoming a much more developed and much more stable democracy. I think there are many elements to this. Institutions, first of all, the first lesson I think I gather from international literature and international best practice is that institutions tend to reinforce each other. If they are good institutions, then they will reinforce each other in very good and stable ways. For instance, if you have an independent Congress, then the president will not make so many mistakes. And you may have good appointments, not bad appointments to particular agencies. And if there's any attempt at corruption or any attempt at impunity, the mere threat of Congress, the mere threat of the accountability mechanisms is enough to actually mitigate the worst of it. So that you actually have a credible threat as far as the accountability mechanism is concerned. So that's how good institutions sort of reinforce each other. Unfortunately, if you have enough bad institutions, they also will reinforce each other, right? So if you have a pliant Congress that doesn't really exercise its oversight role, then a lot of mistakes can happen in budget allocations, in major projects. And that there's going to be very little checks against a very powerful president. He could go on appointing, or she could go on appointing officers of the state with no or little expertise. And they would be not held accountable for their lack of expertise and lack of progress in terms of pushing the reform agenda, or maybe even having a reform agenda to begin with. So I think if you have that kind of an environment, and then when you see this, where loyalty is a primary consideration over expertise, over integrity, then everyone starts to behave to earn loyalty, which is the worst kind of behavior. I call it people auditioning to be noticed and appointed to positions of power. That kind of bureaucratic incentive is totally destructive and should be stopped, because the worst of us will actually rise. The worst of us will emerge to actually head many of these institutions. And given that kind of leadership, the rest of the bureaucracy will actually be discouraged. You will actually deter many good, talented young people from actually joining government. So that kind of an environment, that kind of decay, that kind of cancer, is the kind of decay and cancer that we saw under the Marcos dictatorship. So it's slowly coming back. We're seeing some of the signs, and we must put a stop to it. And I think there's enough of us on the checks and balances side to actually speak truth to power and actually try to stop it, also for its own good, because that is a very self-destructive tendency for some of our leadership and some of our institutions. So I think that's also what we need to work on. In fairness to our president right now, that is a very popular messaging, by the way, because it resonates with many, many individuals who see the inequality that is staring us in the face as far as this country is concerned. And finally, here's this leader who is not going to pretend. He's going to call a spade and say, I'm going to take down this particular family, this particular powerful individual, powerful company. The challenge with this, however, is one, we have heard this before. And if a head of state is indeed serious about taking down this pattern of power concentration, right? The focus needs to be not on individual families or individual companies, but on the system. Because the system keeps on producing powerful families and powerful individual companies. There's nothing wrong with a powerful company. There are many things wrong with a powerful single family, however. So that's the big distinction between. That's why I said to media that I think the oligarchs of this country today are not in business. They are in politics. And there is more money to be made in politics. That's why they actually migrated there. And now they are actually going after business, depressing some of these wealthy families, wealthy companies, and basically exerting their political and economic power even more, right? And I think the best way to think about this is to think of the system. The system is such that we allow them to concentrate power either on the economic side, on the business side, or on the political side. Now, let's start with the economic side first. If you are concentrating economic power, meaning wealth, meaning size, meaning reach, such as what some of our conglomerates now have. Personally, as an economist and as a development researcher who has seen the development of other countries, size is not necessarily a problem. The challenge is when you use that size to depress the growth of other firms. And you use that size to actually depress competition and protect yourself from competition. So the trick then would be, yes, let's allow you to reach some size, but guess what? Remember, we're going to expect you to export and duke it out with the rest of the big companies out there in the international arena. That is actually what the Southeast Asian and East Asian tigers did with their large conglomerates. That is why they did not turn out to be such big rent-seeking entities. The way to apply, to temper the power concentration in these particular firms was to force them out to compete. So it was the competitive pressure of the international arena that actually geared them towards the right kind of size, the right use of their size and power, right? So you need size to actually penetrate the US market, the European Union market, and the Japanese market. Because otherwise, if you're just a small firm, you will never get there. You'll never compete with their big firms, right? So size is forgivable on the economic side. You must be forced to compete. And if you cannot compete here in the country with 110 million people, compete out there in ASEAN where you have something like 800 million people. Compete out there in the North American and European markets where you have even more competitors to face. So that's the economic side. On the political side, I find it difficult to imagine how size can be good in any way. Because the way that size manifests itself in the political sphere is through fat political dynasties. You virtually occupy so many positions in office. And if that's what you're trying to do, some of them say that, Prof. Ron, you know what, with my father who is a governor and my sister who is a congressman, we can together do many great things for this province. And some of them actually start out that way. Let me give them a little bit of credit for that. But the thing is, that kind of concentration of power has no competition tempering it. That is the difference between the economic side, where you force them out to compete in the international arena. Here, in the political sphere, where in a province, give any Philippine province, and you have the governor, the vice governor, the mayor, the congressman, the provincial board member, all related in one political family. There is very little tempering of that power concentration, and therefore, the likely practice of impunity, where you are not going to be able to correct something that is already wrong, is very, very high. So that's the big difference between the two. So you ask me, okay, why are we seeing this all over again? Where the oligarchs, how can we actually address them? Well, if we are willing to apply competition on the economic side, let more players in, but regulate them. You know, you don't just let so many Chinese investors in, but they don't practice good mining practices, or they don't practice good labor practices. Let them in, let the Europeans in, let the Chinese in, let the Americans in, but they follow our regulations. And the playing field is a level playing field. That's fine. But let's have more of them come into our country and apply competition to our own firms. And our own firms, let us actually give them the message and the incentives to go out there and find export markets for us. That's the first part. We've been actually doing some good in that area already. That's why we're seeing a lot of good economic progress in the past few decades. On the political side, applying more competition to the political system, that is where we're failing miserably and lacking still many political reforms that could actually push for competition in the political sphere.
Sorry. Okay, maraming salamat po sa ating tagapagsalita na si Professor Mendoza sa inyong very informative and creative na video na rin. At mukhang marami nang nagtatanong tungkol sa crony capitalism. So, pero bago tayo kumuha at sumagot ng mga tanong mula sa ating mga nanonood ngayon, pakinggan muna natin ang synthesis ng lahat ng ating mga diskusyon mula kay Professor Adonis Elumbre, isang historiador din at profesor mula sa Department of History and Philosophy ng University of the Philippines, Baguio, sa kanyang presentasyon na pinamagatang Corruption and Cronyism Then and Now. Professor Elumbre?
All right. So thank you, Prof. Jason. Good morning, everyone. We would like to thank again our speakers, Professor Emeritus Belinda Aquino, Attorney Ruben Carranza, Dean Ronald Mendoza, for sharing their time and expertise to us. In the pandemic context, we have repeatedly emphasized the need to trust science and its experts as we navigate the public health crisis. I believe in much the same way that we should also emphasize the need to trust our experts in the academe, law, policymaking sector, as well as historians, journalists, communicators, and others, as we collectively confront the political, economic, social crisis of our times. A short note about the cover photo, which was used and referenced to by Professor Aquino earlier. These are images of the infamous concrete bus of Ferdinand Marcos, built and later on blown up in a mountain peak on the way to Baguio. As we say there, solid north appears as another myth, and the northerners may not be generalized as solidly behind the dictator. What we're sure of, especially from our forum today, are solid pieces of evidence that demonstrate the plundering regime of Marcos and his cronies. Para sa synthesis at integrasyon ng talakayan natin, nais ko pong isa konteksto ang mga naibahagi ngayong umaga dun din sa mito na golden age ng ekonomiya ng Pilipinas ang panunungkulan ni Marcos. Kakabit po ito ng naging pagtalakay kahapon na nakatuon sa economic mismanagement o palpak na pamamalakad ng ekonomiya. Ngayong araw naman, tiningnan natin yung malawakang pagnanakaw o plunder sa ating kabangyaman at sa ekonomiya sa kabuuan. Mahalagang maging malinaw ano ang nais nating sabihin o ipakahulugan sa corruption at cronyism. Walang mga tuwirang salin ito sa wika natin, kahit na may mga malapit o kaugnay na kataga gaya ng pagnanakaw o kawatan, tongpats, o sistemang kumpare o kaibigan sa politika. Sangayon sa Transparency.org, isang pandaigdigang organisasyon, tumutukoy ang korupsyon sa pang-aabuso ng mga nasa poder ng ipinagkatiwalang kapangyarihan sa kanila para sa pansariling interes. Pinahihina nito ang demokrasya at sistemang pang-ekonomiya dahil inaalis nito ang pagtitiwala ng publiko sa mga institusyon at proseso natin, bagay na esensyal sa pagpapagalaw ng buong pamahalaan at ng buong lipunan sa katunayan. Sa isang banda, tumutukoy ang crony sa iilang individual o grupo na may access o malapit sa mga nasa kapangyarihan at nakakakuha ng pribilehiyong pang-ekonomiya mula sa gobyerno. Nanggaling ang konsepto kay George Taber, isang periodista sa Time Magazine. Sabi niya, ito ang bersyon ng kapitalismo ni Marcos, kung saan yumayaman ang ilang kaibigan habang patuloy na naghihirap ng karamihan. Sinikap palalimin ang mga ito sa pagbabahagi ng mga tagapagsalita natin ngayong umaga. Partikular na, sinagot nila ang mga tanong gaya ng paano ang sistema ng korupsyon at cronyism ng rehimeng Marcos? Ano ang mga pagtatangka na mabawi itong mga nakaw na yaman? At ano ba ang mga maaari nating matutunang leksyon sa lahat ng ito? Sa keynote ni Professor Aquino, masusundan natin na naganap ang pagnanakaw bago, habang, at pagkatapos ng mismong panunungkulan ni Marcos noong 1986. Papasidhi yung halaga, yung amount sa pag-usad ng panahon. Interesante itong pagtatapos ng panunungkulan ni Marcos dahil binanggit na 2 eroplano na naglalaman ng mga dinala nilang nakaw na yaman ang naimbentaryo ng US Customs sa Honolulu, Hawaii. Sa buong panahon ng pamamalagi ni Marcos sa poder, nakakuha siya, ng kanyang pamilya at crony ng halaga na maaaring hihigit pa sa 10 bilyong dolyar. Plunder of the ages, ang tawag dito ni Professor Aquino, na mapapatunayan sa mahabang listahan ng mga ebidensya na tinatawag na Marcos Papers. Kabilang dito ang mga bank record, kontrata, sariling mga tala ni Marcos mismo. Umiikot ito sa mga monopolyo ng industriya, mga pautang, kickback at iba pa. May tatanong natin, paano ito naipuslit at naitago sa labas ng bansa? Gawain ito ng mga diktador at kriminal noong panahong ito. Ang malasindikato na pagdeposito sa mga offshore account na pinadali gamit ang teknolohiya noon, no? Na meron na noon, na mabilisang transfer at pag-wire ng pera sa mga multinational na bangko na nagagarantiya ng proteksyon. Sa mga Swiss bank na napatanyag ang pseudonym ng mag-asawang Marcos na William Saunders at Jane Ryan nang magbukas sila ng accounts doon. Liban pa sa paraang yan, gumamit din si Marcos ng frontman. Halimbawa, at ito'y napasadahan na lamang kanina, no? Si Dewey D, upang makapumuhunan si Marcos sa mga bangko at makapagnegosyo sa labas ng bansa. Siyempre pa, pinagmumulan din ng kinupit na pera ang pinansyal na suporta mula sa Estados Unidos na tila pikit mata sa korupsyon alang-alang sa pagpapanatili ng base militar nila sa Pilipinas noong panahong ito. Paksa naman ni Atty. Carranza ang paghahabol at pagbawi sa mga nakaw na yaman ng diktador. Simboliko na sa mismong ginustong petsa ni Marcos ng Deklarasyon ng Batas Militar, September 21, 1972, naganap ang pagbubukas niya ng isang bank account sa labas ng bansa. Isa-isang pinakita ni Atty. Carranza ang mga enabler o katuwang ni Marcos sa pagnanakaw sa kabangyaman, gaya ng mga general, mga negosyanteng crony, ibang gobyerno at korporasyon, mga institusyong nagpapautang gaya ng World Bank at International Monetary Fund, papang mga bangko sa labas ng bansa, pangunahin na nga ang mga Swiss bank, at kahit pa nga ang Universidad ng Pilipinas. No? Ito rin siguro ang dahilan kung bakit natin idinaraos itong dambana ng gunita upang kumprontahin din ang naging papel natin sa universidad sa kasaysayang ito. Hindi naging madali ang paghahabol at pagbawi ng mga nakaw na yaman. Bagamat may mga tala ng tagumpay, gaya ng kaso ng crony na si Dicini, na nabawi natin, no? Naipanalo natin ang kaso, no? Laban sa crony na si Dicini, may mga mapanghamong kaso rin, gaya ng kaso ng Arelma. Tinukoy ni Atty. Carranza rito ang pangangailangan sa competence ng mga naghahabol sa nakaw na yaman sa mga larangan gaya ng forensic accounting at kahit na kasaysayan. Hamon din ang pakikipag-ugnayan, halimbawa sa kaso ng Switzerland, na hanggang press release lang ang kayang ilabas kaugnay ng itinago nilang yaman ng mga Marcos. Mahalaga ang mga nabawing pondong ito na inilaban upang magamit sa pagkilala at reparasyon sa mga biktima ng paglabag sa mga karapatang pantao ni Marcos. Tumuon naman ang pagbabahagi ni Dean Mendoza sa mga aral na maaaring makuha mula sa karanasan natin sa crony capitalism ni Marcos. Ang pangunahing issue aniya ay ang konsentrasyon ng kapangyarihan at kayamanan sa iilan. Sa antas pampolitika sa kasalukuyan, makikita ito sa pagpapatuloy ng mga mini-dictatorships o naglalakihang dinastiyang politikal sa Pilipinas. Pinanggit din niya na nananatili ang mga bureaucratic incentive gaya ng questionableng pagtatalaga ng mga kaibigan halimbawa sa posisyon at pagkontrol ng pork barrel bilang paraan ng sentralisasyon ng kapangyarihan. Isang makabuluhang leksyon din ang paghamon sa mga monopolyo sa ekonomiya na masusundan halimbawa sa pangangamkam ni Marcos at ng kanyang mga crony sa mga negosyo noong panahon ng diktadorya. Hindi lang ito labag sa patas na kompetisyon, kundi isa ring larangan ng korupsyon. Sa huli, gaya ng makikita rin ngayon, retorika lang ang sinasabing paglansag o paggiba sa oligarkiya. Pinalitan lang noon at pinapalitan lang ngayon ang mga kaaway na oligarko na mga paboritong crony ng nasa poder. Sa lahat ng ito, malinaw ang kahinaan ng ating mga institusyon. Noong batas militar, pawang nakapailalim sa diktador ang mga institusyon. wala ang naririnig din natin ngayong prinsipyo ng checks and balances. Upang mabaliktad ang sistemang ito, aniya, kakailanganin ng malakas na demokratikong pagtugon o democratic pushback na lilikha ng iba't ibang sentro ng kapangyarihan sa mga lokalidad at pamayanan, gayon din ng mga matatag na institusyong panlipunan. Ngayon, kung pagsasama-samahin ang Voltes 5, ganito maaaring tingnan ng korupsyon at cronyism sa istilong McCoy. State-sponsored ito, sistematiko, at may malawak na network sa loob at labas ng bansa. Gamit pa ang isang TV series, pwede rin sigurong sagot ito sa tanong na kung paano ba magnakaw at makatakas sa pagnanakaw. Gaya ng nabanggit ni Professor Aquino, ang pinagkaiba ng korupsyon sa panahon ni Marcos at ang tipikal o petty corruption ay ang saklaw ng pagnanakaw na masusundan o matitrace hanggang sa diktador mismo at ang kanyang pamilya. Walang ibang paglalarawan dito kundi state-sponsored o gobyerno mismo ang nangunguna sa pagnanakaw. Hindi lang iilang individual o ahensya ang dawit, kundi ang kalakhan ng burokrasya mismo. Makikita rin na sistematiko siya. Ibig sabihin may sinusundang proseso o metodo sa pagnanakaw at pagmamalabis ng ekonomiya si Marcos at ang mga kumpare at kaibigan niya. Yung higit na pag-unawa at pushback sa sistemang ito ay importanteng gawain kung nais nating putulin ang cycle ng korupsyon at cronyism tulad ng nasabi ni Dean Mendoza at ni Atty. Carranza na din. Panghuli, ekstensibo o malawak yung network ng mga involved na tao, korporasyon, bangko at global financial institutions. Talagang may transnational dynamics o pandaigdigang katangian ang bilyong dolyar na pagnanakaw ng diktador sa wika nga ni Professor Aquino. Pinadali nito hindi lang ang pagnanakaw, kundi yung matabunan mismo ang bakas ng pagnanakaw. Patunay halimbawa ang paghahabol at matagumpay na pagsasakdal ni Atty. Carranza sa pamilya Marcos sa mga tagong yaman sa Switzerland, US at iba pang bansa na may lehitimong trail ng mga ebidensya ng sistematiko at garapalang pandarambong sa pera ng bayan. Ngayon, hindi po ito kasama sa mga pagbabahagi kanina, no? Bagamat may ilang comparison doon sa presentasyon sa AVP ni Dean Mendoza. No? Pero mahalagang maidagdag natin dahil laging bahagi ng kasaysayan ng kasalukuyan. No? Taong 2016 ang sabihin ng kasalukuyang Pangulo na one whiff of corruption and you're out. Pero tila kontradiksyon ang pag-ikot o pag-recycle ng mga questionabling individual na may record ng korupsyon sa iba't ibang ahensya ng pamahalaan. Mula 2016 hanggang kasalukuyan, baka hindi na nga whiff o faint smell ang korupsyon. Talagang nakakasulasok na ito. Bagay na inamin din naman ng Pangulo sa isang pessimistikong pahayag kung saan sinabi niya na corruption is endemic in the government. Hindi na raw ito mapipigilan, maliban na lang kung magdeklara raw ng martial law. Kung may isang natutunan tayo sa naging talakayan kanina, ito yung hindi martial law ang makakapigil sa korupsyon. Sa karanasan natin kay Marcos, martial law pa ang nagpaigting sa korupsyon. Mahalagang tanungin sa gayon, sa harap ng sinusundan nating investigasyon sa Senado halimbawa, kung may katulad bang pattern sa likod ng kasalukuyang anomalya. Ano ang papel ng palasyo rito at ang personal na koneksyon ng presidente? Ano ang sistema o metodo nito? Gaano kalawak ang network nito ng mga individual, korporasyon at ahensya sa loob at labas ng bansa? Ano't anuman, ang higit na masaklap ay nagaganap itong lahat sa konteksto ng pandemya, kung saan nagagamit sana ang pondo sa higit na pagpapabuti ng healthcare system at pagbibigay ayuda. Halos kalahating dekada na ang nakalipas, pero naririyan pa rin ang multo ng istilong Marcos na pagnanakaw at pagpapabor sa mga kaibigan. At dito natin naistapusin ang paglalagong na ito. Para sa akin, hindi lang nagnakaw sa Kaban ng Bayan si Marcos, kundi nagnakaw din siya ng kinabukasan ng bayan. Sa gayon, hindi talaga golden age ng ekonomiya ng panahon niya. No? Tingin ko isa tong golden age ng pagnanakaw. Nakakahiyaman at nabanggit ito ni Professor Teles kanina. Pero wag nating kalimutan na sa Guinness World Record natin si Marcos sa kanyang, and I quote, greatest robbery of a government. Sa mga nagbahaging tagapagsalita, nakita natin ang buong proseso nitong pagnanakaw. At tampok dito ang sentral na papel ng mismong gobyerno, kaya din ang sistematiko at sentralisadong pamamaraan at malawak na network ng korupsyon at cronyism. Makikita rin na nagpapatuloy ang pananaliksik sa paksang ito, ang pagbubunyag, pagpapaalala sa publiko, at paghahabol sa mga nakaw na yaman ng mga Marcos at kanyang mga crony. Hindi ito saradong kabanata at patuloy tayo sa paghugot ng mga aral mula sa kasaysayan sa yugtong ito. Finalmente, kailangan magpatuloy ang pagsusulong ng kultura ng pananagutan o accountability sa pamahalaan. Ano man ang kulay o sino mang tatay, ang pagnanakaw ay pagnanakaw. Sa isang banda, ang pananagutan ay hindi lang din sa usaping pera o pagsampa ng kaso, bagamat napakahalaga ng mga ito. Tingin ko pananagutan din ang nais natin sa kasaysayan, na maniningil at maniningil ito sa mga nagnakaw sa Kaban at kinabukasan ng bayan. Bilang paglalagom na rin siguro sa buong programa ng dambana ng gunita sa nakalipas na 5 araw, at bilang pag-uugnay na rin sa sitwasyon natin ngayon at pagtanaw sa susunod na taon, maitatanong natin mula sa mga batayang katotohanan at aral ng batas militar. Ayos lang ba kung ang pinuno o mga sumusuporta at enabler ng pinuno ay sinungaling at lulong sa kapangyarihan, marahas at lumilika ng kaguluhan, mamamatay tao at walang pagpapahalaga sa batayang karapatan, palpak sa pamamalakad ng ekonomiya at pahirap sa kabuhayan ng tao, magnanakaw sa kaban ng bayan. Malinaw ang sagot sa naging pagbabalik tanaw natin sa kasaysayan. Sana ay naging malinaw din ang pagpapasya natin sa darating na halalan. Maraming salamat po sa pakikinig at manatili po tayong ligtas at lumalaban.
Yan, so maraming salamat po, Professor Alumbre, sa inyong synthesis at integration para sa ating mga naging speakers ngayong taon. So sa tingin ko, magandang isipin natin yung mga huling katanungan ni Professor Alumbre habang nag-iisip tayo kung sino nga ba yung iboboto natin, o sino yung bibigyan natin ng pahintulot para pamunuan tayo sa ating bansa sa susunod na eleksyon, sa eleksyon na darating sa 2022 nga. So ngayon, sa bahagi ng ito ng programa natin, pumunta na tayo sa ating open forum at muli inaanyayahan natin ating mga manonood na magtanong gamit ang ating chat box or Q&A box. At sa ngayon, marami na tayong nagtatanong. Unahin na natin at inaanyayahan ko na rin po sina Dr. Lindy Aquino, sina Professor Ronald Mendoza at si Attorney Carranza na magbukas po tayo ng microphones natin at pag sasagot po tayo ay magbukas po tayo ng mga mikropono po natin para sumagot sa mga katanungan na ito. So, unang katanungan po siguro at medyo pagsasamahin ko na po yung dalawang tanong dito kasi medyo related naman po sila. Unang tanong mula sa ating chat box. Yan po. So, meron ba tayong alam po or is there a research on what are the factors or reasons behind bakit kaya yung mga facts and evidences na meron tayo ngayon about the loot or the thievery of Marcos during his dictatorship ay divided pa rin tayo sa issue na to. So kung wala namang research, siguro mga pananaw na lang po natin kung bakit divided pa rin tayo sa issue na to. At siguro connected din to sa isang question dito sa huli na paano natin to ibababak sa mga nasa grassroots or sa mga eskwelahan na according to some of our audience members ay hindi ata natuturuan tungkol sa martial law nung basic education at nung college na lang nila na pagtatanto na may nangyaring ganito nga or even yung pagnanakaw ni Marcos. So anybody po sa ating mga speakers? Dr. Lindy, Attorney Carranza, or Sir Mendoza, or even si Ma'am Nela Florendo po and si Professor Adonis Elumbre. Pwede rin pong sumagot sa ating katanungan.
I'm not sure I get the question. Hindi ako sigurado kung tama ang intindi ko dun sa tanong. Kung may research ba tungkol sa pagnanakaw ng mga Marcos at bakit hanggang ngayon it divides the people. I think those are two different questions that don't necessarily follow each other. Of course, merong record of corruption, at hindi lang corruption, merong record of asset recovery. Some of those records are complex because the corruption that happened during the dictatorship took decades and were very complex in terms of the transactions. Pero hindi ibig sabihin na hindi ito pwedeng ma-simplify. No? Dumukot ako ng libro. No? Ito yung libro ni Senator Jovito Salonga. Sinulat niya to in a way from a personal perspective, pero mahusay ang pagkasulat dahil it's a narration of how he did his job as PCGG chairperson, the first one under the Aquino government. It's an example of how you can simplify the process of asset recovery. And itong libro na to ginamit ng ibang mga researchers. Halimbawa, may copy ako somewhere here. There's an Israeli researcher who looked at the relationship between the cases filed by victims of the Marcos dictatorship in the US and the asset recovery efforts of the PCGG. No, so sinama ko siya halimbawa dun sa isang meeting ng Reparations Board sa Pilipinas some years ago. Ginamit niya itong libro ni Senator Salonga at yung records ng PCGG. So to cut that long answer short, merong record. Ang wala, siguro na pwedeng gawin pa at pwedeng makakatulong. Naalala ko na sa PCGG ako, meron kaming CD-ROM because the technology at that time was CD-ROM. So all the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court and the Sandigan Bayan were accessible in that CD-ROM.
So how do I do that?
Later.
Yeah.
Pwedeng
Sige po, ipagpatuloy po natin, Attorney Carranza.
Can I?
Okay.
Can I speak?
Patapusin po natin Attorney Carranza po, Dr. Lindy.
Sige, Professor Lindy, I'll wind this up.
Okay.
So importante na yung jurisprudence involving asset recovery, involving the PCGG, ma-simplify. Pero ang isang pangalawang punto dito na importante, the way journalists report on the PCGG on cases involving the Marcoses and their cronies. It's often depicted as a win or lose battles. And I can understand that. No? Ganun ang pag-consume ng media sa Pilipinas. At siguro yung, the TV patrol tradition has really ruined journalism in the Philippines because now it's a boxing match. No? Parang sabong na lang. No? Marcos ba? Panalo ba? Hindi. In fact, it's not the PCGG versus the Marcoses. It's the people of the Philippines versus the Marcoses. But it's never reported that way. Pangalawa, yung jurisprudence is far more complicated, and to the credit of, halimbawa, si Chief Justice Maylo Sereno, she lays out the situation in a way na hindi black and white. So, importante halimbawa, for example lang, may isang report a few months ago saying yung isang kaso na final against the Marcoses involving $2 billion in claims was dismissed by the Supreme Court. What was left unsaid is the fact that the Sandigan Bayan ruling, which the Supreme Court essentially upheld, said that the assets involved could actually be pursued under the existing forfeiture judgment in 2003. How do you report that? How do you simplify that? So naiintindihan ko rin yung dilemma ng mga journalists. So to switch quickly to that accompanying question, bakit nakakahati ito? one big reason is the Marcoses still have assets to keep up the lying, to keep up the deception, to fund false information about them. One of the questions at chat box was, can we go after the candidacy of Marcos Jr. and determine how he has been able to fund his campaign? As a matter of fact, in 2015, I wrote to one of the former Comelec commissioners, who was I think 1 year below me in law school. Sumulat ako sa kanya to ask why they were not checking campaign finance funding of the Marcoses when there is a final ruling by the Supreme Court saying all their assets are ill-gotten except for this amount of money. So that should be a clear legal basis to look at where else are they getting money. So, pwede nating ma-simplify ito, pwedeng gamitin halimbawa ng mga law professors sa College of Law. If the College of Law leadership was not busy inaugurating rooms named after Juan Ponce Enrile or Estelito Mendoza, maybe they should come around to actually helping Filipinos go after the Marcos family.
Okay pa. So, Dr. Belinda Aquino. Ayan pa. Ayan.
Again, talk now.
Yes. Yes po. Narinig na po namin kayo.
Okay. Salamat kay Attorney Ruben kasi the points that he brought up are very valid. Unfortunately, yung mga readership natin sa media, hindi yan, I don't mean to put them down, but yung kanilang mga binabasa, mga bulgar, mga ganon, kasi yun ang kanilang lengguwahe, no? Pero tama siya na the issues that concern us in the academic world, hindi maintindihan ng mga tao yan. And I think this also goes back a lot to the history of the Marcoses, for instance. There are people, lots and lots of them, especially his mga kababayan, who owed their livelihood to him because, our history is, in a sense, still feudal. I mean, it's a leader-follower kind of thing. And the questions that concern us in the academic world, equality, human rights, and pagnanakaw and all that kind of thing, those are all erased by this very circular kind of explanation that all goes back to the fact that, tignan mo yun sa Ilocos, kung hindi si Marcos na kapag ng infrastructure, wala namang ganyang facilities tayo, na mayroon ng roads to the mountainside, and the people can go down and so on and so forth. So they equate, they have a frame of reference that is different from ours. So hindi tayo ma-unify ng issues na sinasabi natin which should be the case. No? So I think we need a lot of historical explanation for this, for one thing. Of course, there are other things. Now, nung nagtatrabaho pa ako sa PCGG, nakakausap ko si Salonga, nagagalit siya. Kasi maraming kaso na hindi naman manalo ang mga abogado ng PCGG. And I said, do you want me to supply you with people from my law office or something? So para naman, mayroong makikita naman na nanalo tayo sa kaso na ito, na nandiyan na yung mga because there are things naman na sinasabi ni Attorney Ruben, yung 500,685 million na pananalo naman yan by virtue of the fact na yan ang mga final ng PCGG. Maraming kaso, 300, 400 and all that kind of thing. Hindi ma-cope ng ating mga abogado yung mga yon kasi mahirap samantala yung mga cronies ni Marcos, ang dami-daming pera. So they can file one motion after another para ma-dismiss, para maganda ito, and mga sequestration cases. kine-question yan, bakit daw mayroong ganon, and parang kuan ba, yung ganyan. So those are the issues that don't concern them. These are gut issues that people are interested in. So that's one reason na hindi tayo makabuo unified kind of that will bring about a real revolution. Kasi ang nangyari sa atin, we are very proud of people power. 4 days lang, it took a revolution, the shortest in world history. But alam mo, that revolution na we are so proud of, ang talsik lang natin si Marcos and his cronies, but the whole machinery of the oppression and all the things that they did na kalokohan, nandiyan pa rin sila. You know, so we need a bit of educating the people na in a language or position or perspective that they understand, so that maano sila. Kasi tignan mo yung people power, in 4 days, may million people gathering in EDSA, and that was because they had a single purpose at that time, to vote the Marcoses out of the Philippines. So ganyan, this is like just one way of looking at it. But Ruben did a good job of being very logical about this series of events that I could only discuss in general terms. Ganoon.
Okay. Maraming salamat po, Dr. Lindy. Kayo po, Professor Ronald Mendoza, meron po kayong masasabi tungkol dito?
Ay, thank you. Dadagdag ko lang kasi maganda naman yung sagot nila Attorney Ruben at ni Prof. Dadagdag ko lang na merong mga new factors to consider in today's world, such as misinformation and fake news na sinusubukan ng mga dark forces na linlangin yung mga kabataan natin. At syempre, marami sa kanila, marahil maririnig nila for the first time yung mga history, yung mga facts and evidence. Maganda kung mauna yung katotohanan kaysa dun sa fake news, di ba? Pero paano kung nababad sila sa fake news kung yun yung naririnig nila? So I think this is one of the things that we need to consider. Second is, I agree with the argument na this could have been a teaching moment for our country. Dapat sana na-integrate to sa pagtuturo natin ng basic things like nationalism, like integrity in government, na dapat sana lahat ng batang Pilipino matututunan ang lessons from that era of our governance. Pero we missed out on that. It was not well integrated. In fact, in other parts of the country, medyo fake news nga yung nabibigay doon sa mga bata instead of katotohanan. So I think we need to do a much better job there. The problem, however, is, as I mentioned already, and this is my third explanation of why it has become so difficult, hinayaan nating lumago yung mga dark forces. Hinayaan nating lumago yung mga, yung basically the same monsters of the system who do not really care about changing the system or introducing real reformists in government. So, yan, yung nagkaroon na maraming fat dynasty. In fact, many of them are actually, basically practicing the same bad governance as a dictator, right? At madaling bilhin. So, kung merong powerful na emerging leader na pwedeng makipag-deal sa kanila, malamang makukuha yung suporta nitong mga ganitong klaseng traditional politicians. Hindi kasi reforma ang nagtutulak sa kanila sa serbisyo sa gobyerno, kundi yung kanilang personal na interes. So nagiging mas mahirap para sa atin to build the institutions that will protect us from that concentration of power, again, on both the political sphere and also on the economic sphere. So that is the challenge of our generation, I think.
Okay. So medyo mahirap nga po talaga yung battle natin with this information. At nung isang araw po may nakakakwentuhan akong mga kapwa ko Ilocano. So kami mga Ilocano, nag-uusap kami sa isang Twitter space at yun nga yung napag-usapan namin na ang hirap tibagin nung mga napakaraming siniksik or dinikdik sa amin simula nung bata kami kasi kadalasan experience ng magulang yung mas namamayani kaysa sa kung ano yung facts na nire-release sa kanila ng mga eskwelahan nila o so on and so forth. So sa tingin niyo po, paano pa kaya natin ito mabibigyan ng solusyon, lalong-lalo na sa mga lugar? Parang may mga nag-comment din po sa chat box natin na may mga politiko dito na matagal nang kaalyado ng mga Marcos na pilit na pinapakalat pa rin yung mga disinformation na to. So medyo na didikdik sa amin bilang mga kabataan itong mga mito at mga kasinungalingan na to sa amin. So sa tingin niyo po, paano pa natin itong mapapaigting yung advokasiyang ito? Bukod po sa mga nasabi niyo na po. So, kasi sa ngayon po talagang ang mga Gen Z, millennials tulad namin, more on TikTok or Facebook. Yun, tapos Instagram pa. So medyo ang hirap i-penetrate ng mga yun kasi nauna na po sila. Sinabi po ninyo kanina na unahan natin sila pero nauna na po sila sa atin. So paano natin to gagawin dun sa mga spaces na ito sa tingin niyo po?
May I complete what I just said?
Yes po.
Kanina, because I have in front of me, it says status of recovery and the Marcos loot by the Philippine government, and it comes from Rappler. You know, Rappler that Maria Ressa is heading until now, but he has been jailed several times already. But one of our faculty, Professor Jojo Abinales, has gotten like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For instance, just an example. As of September 2021, which is this month, PCG has already recovered a total of 174 billion pesos from the Marcoses. Oh, yung pagnanakaw na yan, hindi ba more than plunder? If there's a word bigger than plunder, that's it. 79 billion pesos has been distributed to farmers through the Agrarian Reform Program. Alam mo yung CARP, yung Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, it was passed by Congress as a law. Okay? Yung nakukuha from the loot, ibibigay sa kanila, yung mga farmers na. The other one is 76 billion pesos has been awarded to farmers through the Coco Levy Trust Fund. And I think Attorney Ruben was talking about this kanina, hindi ba? Yung Levy Trust Fund na one of those na the Cojuangcos, Cojuangco got it back in addition to San Miguel and all that. And then another 11 billion pesos has been earmarked for the compensation of human rights victims. Magkano lang ang nakuha nila, yung number of victims? The trial was held in Hawaii. We had to help them because they just came here on their own money, and there were two lawyers, one of them Sherry Broder, and they were given only 1,000 each. Itong mga nakumuha ng kwan, but that's really peanuts. Finally, 50 billion pesos worth of assets for sale or privatization. Now, I don't know what this means, but it shows what can be done just to emphasize the fact that itong pagnanakaw na ito, garapal na talaga. Hindi ba nakukuha ng mga tao? Hindi ba susukay ang mga ganyan? And about 125 billion pesos are still to be recovered. Oh, that should be a step. But all these PCG mandates that was created by Executive Order number 1 should be followed. Parang ano naman, I don't know how you do that. Going through the educational system is a good idea. Para so our educational system also has to be revamped or reinforced with these kinds of data sa mga bata para naintindihan nila, kasi Alam mo, nagturo ako ng Philippine history pa na hindi man ako historian. Some of our students, hindi nila alam that the Philippines was under Spain for 300 years. And another 48 or 50 under the Americans for a new colonial master, mga ganon. So, I don't know, there's something basically wrong also with our structural institutions. Something like that. So, we need a much more revolutionary approach to this kasi kung pagtapon lang ng talsikin lang natin itong mga kalokohan, that's not a real revolution. So that's what I can add to this question of what is appropriate, what is doable, and so on. So things like this are good in the sense that we should always be reminded that these are things that people forget, but it's good to remember that there are people who still care about the future of the country in terms of abstraction and ideas that will make the country better. Ganun lang.
Okay po. Sa inyo po, Professor Mendoza or Attorney Carranza, may dadagdag pa po ba kayo?
Sige, I'll go ahead. Actually, I just wanted to share na it has become so bad that the mere idea of an authoritarian ang kalaban natin ngayon. It's actually not just Marcos na ang issue kundi maraming mga Pilipinong naniniwala na kailangan ng malakas na pangulo para isolve yung mga problema natin. And I think the more uncertainty our nation faces, the more inequality our nation faces, the more seductive the message of an authoritarian becomes, a populist authoritarian, which I think what Marcos was. He was the first one, I think, to promise the end of oligarchies. So yung pambubuli po ng malaking business, hindi po itong present occupant of Malacanang ang nauna dyan. Marami pong gumamit na ng mga linya na yan way back in the 1960s, 1970s. So ang nangyari, as was expertly discussed by Attorney Ruben and Prof. Aquino, pinalitan lang nila yung may-ari, pero hindi nila pinalitan yung sistema. The same extractive system is in place, right? Tapos, dinagdagan pa niya ng dictatorship, mainly the concentration of power. So that's the really powerful mixture that can lead you into crisis, political and economic. So that's what happened to us. Ngayon, ang fear po ng mga katulad ko, nakikita po natin sa surveys na marami pong Pilipinong naniniwala kailangan ulit natin ng malakas na pinuno, ng strongman. So I think really the discussion needs to be led by our youth, yung po mga bata. Kasi talaga pong ang usapin na po ngayon ay hindi lang kung ano yung nakaraan, kundi saan tayo papunta. Right? So I think people like us, the ex-youth, we can help as much as providing evidence and helping juxtapose the facts, right? And the knowledge. But really, it is a discussion among the young people on where you will take this country. Because if we are going to gamble again on an authoritarian, we did that before and our generation paid the price. So kung yan po ulit ang seduction ng mga panibagong mga magpapromise niyan, marami pong pwedeng mag-share katulad ko, Attorney Ruben, Prof. Aquino, and many others that is probably not gonna work out for many, many reasons that we already know.
Okay po. Marami pong salamat. So I guess pwede na tayong mag-move on sa isang question pa po. Although nasagot na to ni Professor Mendoza, tatanungin ko ulit baka gusto niyo pong i-expand pa yung discussion. So sabi dito ng isang anonymous attendee, with our current state of weak democratic institutions, is a strong civil society sufficient to keep government impunity at bay? How then do we strengthen civil society in socio-political atmosphere that continues to dismantle civil society as an institution? Yan po. So may sagot na po si Professor Mendoza. Baka gusto niyo pong i-expand pa ito or mas i-expound pa para sa ating mga audience ngayon.
Sige, Jason. So siguro ako ulit. Pero sana magsalita din yung dalawa nating guests. ang tingin ko kasi yung civil society natin sa Pilipinas, we used to be very, very well known, probably we still are, for having one of the strongest civil societies in Asia. Yan ang branding natin sa Asian region. This is how the international arena knows us. Pero I look back and I now do research on governance and institutions. I began to realize na civil society actually makes up for the failures of our leaders. Nagse-step in sila dahil palpak yung education system, dahil walang pagkain, kailangan mag-organize tayo ng community pantry, dahil kailangan bantayan yung congressman kasi baka ibulsa niya yung build budget niya, yung pork barrel niya. So the civil society is there because of the malfunctioning governance on the side of those who are supposed to represent our interests in government. So on the one hand, magandang malakas yung civil society natin. On the other hand, I began to realize, and now I would like to share with all of you, maybe share what you think about it. I think we really need a strong bureaucracy for our government. Dapat po kung gusto natin ng magandang gobyerno, let us invest in our government. One of the participants said it is quite paradoxical that we are talking about government corruption and cronyism. And here is Dean Ron Mendoza of the Ateneo School of Government saying we should invest in government. Actually, I don't think it's paradoxical. We deserve the kind of bad government we have also because, not just because of the elected side, but also of the bureaucratic side na medyo mahina po, kailangan po nila ng tulong natin, kailangan po nila ng stronger investment. So ano po ibig sabihin yan? Kailangan po professional talaga yung bureaucracy natin. The kind of bureaucracy that can stand up to a populist like Donald Trump. So it's the military of the Americans who said no. It's the justice system of the Americans who said no. Ganun po yung kailangan natin sa ating sistema ng malakas at full of integrity po yung ating government bureaucracy. So that is really one of my own realizations now that I am in academia. We cannot keep on critiquing our government and yet not equipping it with good people. We need to supply government with good people, and when they're there, continue to invest in them.
Pero, we also have really structural, fundamental problems in the society that will perpetuate this kind of the inability of the government to get the trust of the people because of the way that it has solved supposedly problems like poverty, corruption, and so on, and same old kind of thing. So what do you do in that regard? I mean, the only time we use people power was when we had that EDSA, 1 million people that throw out the head, the person from the top lang. But naiwan naman yung furniture, the whole the room was not touched, but only certain people, only certain types of people. So it is a circular problem, and I won't pretend to know how to, accept that in the public administration school where I was, my late friend, Lady Carino, also, who was a very good analyst, critiqued that the kinds of things that you're saying. So how do you develop trust in government, which is very difficult, no? We go around and around. It's because of the educational system, and then the people don't learn what they should be learning in terms of how to improve the whole society and that kind of thing. But I think there have been cases where naman, we have just the PCGG alone, getting all these cases before the courts, maski naman ma-dismiss ang Sandigan Bayan and all that kind of thing. But I think hope is what we have, but unfortunately that is more of an ideal, that's more of an abstraction. But what can we do? We have to go further down in the society, in the whole society, to correct all these inabilities, weaknesses. Government, as I'm guilty of saying that all the time, but and then people come back to me, so what do you do then? You know, that should be, I think, what we should be talking about next time as a sequel to this kind of discussion. We should not stop, you know. I mean, whatever. Itong ang observation na ito, sabi lang, where do you stand? It is remembering or forgetting or whatever. You know, it's neither nor or either or, neither this and that. We have to have a broader understanding, and action should not be, laid aside. Because you think of real revolution like the Battle of Algiers. Nakita nyo ba yon sa sine? The French, they threw out the French. You know, by in that Kasbah, they were in that Kasbah. This is the slums in Algeria and all that. So, ganyan. But I understand the whole dismal history that we have had in supporting this. Samantala, meron naman tayong mga heroes in the past. May Rizal yan, may Bonifacio yan, may So, I think we have to go deeper into the broader picture, broader picture.
Okay, maraming
That's easier said than done.
Maraming salamat po. Nag-unmute po si Attorney Carranza. May gusto po siyang sabihin.
I was going to add two things. Dun sa earlier question about young people and reaching young people. And one of the examples from my work has been how not only culture, popular music, dance has been used to reach out to young people, but it has been used to reach out to young people because in some of the countries where I work, the poverty is such that technology is inaccessible, so that even the idea of TikTok assumes that you can have data, you can afford to pay for data. So I work in the Gambia. Tomorrow I have to speak to a forum like this, where a dictator was ousted 3 years ago. He fled, and now they have a truth commission that is wrapping up its work, and then they have assets being recovered from the dictator. Some of them involving houses in the United States. With the help of the US government, they were identified, they were sold, the proceeds were returned. And I have used the experience of the Philippines in using assets that were recovered to fund a reparations program in the Gambia, for Gambia. But it's a very poor country, and it's a country lacking in resources. And so some of the work has been, and also because illiteracy is so high, hip hop has been used to explain what the Truth Commission is doing. There was a hip hop festival that ICTJ, where I work, co-organized in the Gambia. We learned from that activity, and then we exported it to Colombia, where it's a different context, armed conflict, there's a peace agreement, but you're trying to pursue justice and accountability. So a separate hip hop festival, drawing lessons from what we learned from the Gambia. And then we had these two hip hop festivals happen together, the Gambia and Colombia. The point here is that global South countries have much to learn from each other. And while I agree with Ronald about building institutions, I'm not sure that the United States is where I would draw inspiration from in terms of institutional capacity, because the institutional capacity here in the United States was built up from imperialism. That's why you have a strong bureaucracy, because you have this base of imperialism that has accumulated so much capital that there's an interest among huge capitalists and corporations here to make sure that the bureaucracy protects their property. You can't import that notion to a very poor developing country where the bureaucracy is the source of corruption, because it's one way to accumulate capital, right? So that's one of the premises that you have to deal with. Now, I would, like I said, draw from global South examples. And one example I can think of that might be relevant for the Philippines is Chile. The last slide I showed, which said something about you can't make the past disappear. was a slide from a historian who has written a book about civilian complicity in the Pinochet dictatorship. Civilian complicity in the Pinochet dictatorship. Everyone from businessmen to bankers to journalists who were complicit in the Pinochet dictatorship. Remember, the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet ended just 4 years after the Marcos dictatorship. And yet, the post-Pinochet government was able to establish 2 truth commissions, a still running reparations program, prosecute several generals, recover some assets of Pinochet, and now drafting a constitution led by an indigenous people's leader to correct the neoliberal assumptions that were never corrected even during the post-Pinochet period. So it's very important to connect our efforts to address corruption and not just think of it as good government. I actually hate the name of the PCGG because what the hell is good government? It's such a useless point, a useless term that it doesn't mean anything. But it's there. And while I'm on that aside right now, that's also the reason for some of the legal problems that the PCGG had in the middle of its work. The premise of the PCGG was that if we sequester assets of Marcoses and the cronies and then prove that they stole them, we will win. This was based on the Western notion of due process where, presumption of innocence, everyone being equal, we can find a way. But that's foolish because you're just emerging from a dictatorship which already distorted your judicial system so much that there is no way you can then use that same theoretical notion of due process to prove that the Marcoses and their cronies were corrupt. So that other countries have in fact learned from the Philippines. Peru is an example where instead of using the PCGG notion of will sequester and then prove that they stole, in Peru they confiscated and forced Fujimori and his cronies to prove that they acquired their assets legally. Otherwise, the confiscation stood and they were used for reparations. So there's a lot to learn from each other. There's a lot to learn from our own failures. And, I mentioned Chile. Pinochet died 2006. His dictatorship ended in 1990. They're still at it. So it's 50 years. It's nothing. It's nothing given where we are. We have no choice. The past cannot be erased. We have to deal with it.
Okay, maraming salamat po, Attorney Carranza, sa yung very informative na sagot sa ating tanong kanina. So, isa pang tanong po dito from an anonymous attendee na nasagot na rin po ni Professor Mendoza, pero pwede niya pang expound yung sagot niya dito. So, is it a bit paradoxical to think that one of the solutions in preventing corruption is strengthening our government institutions, but given what can be observed today, most of the appointees in crucial positions in these institutions have tendency to lean on leaders who encourage inaccountability and promote ways for establishing corruption. So medyo related din po ito sa mga sagot kanina.
So
yes.
Ako ba, Jason?
Sige pa.
Okay. I guess kasi nga ang nangyayari, pinaayos nga natin yung institutions pero bigla na lang yung ombudsman natin hindi naniniwala sa SALN. Kasi pinalitan siya at yung pampalit ay hindi pala naniniwala dun sa institusyon. So buti kung si Attorney Ruben yung in-appoint doon, baka mas matino pa. Pero basically maling tao yung nilagay. Kung iisipin nyo yan, pag-iisipan natin from a systems perspective, dapat sa Congress pa lang, ginigrill na yung appointee. Bakit siya yung pipiliin mo? Wala namang alam yung USEC na yan sa budgeting. Bakit siya ngayon ang gagawing USEC sa DBM? At yan na nga, naging link siya sa Pharmally, di ba? Dapat kasi ganun eh. As I'm writing a paper right now on institutions. Good institutions support each other. Unfortunately, bad institutions also support each other. So kung palpak yung Congress, malamang palpak din yung mga appointments kasi hindi niya ayusin yun eh. Malamang palpak din yung mga budget allocations kasi hindi niya babantayan yun. So we need to do extra work as a people. We need civil society groups. Kaya nga po si Ateneo, si UP, si LaSalle, Si UST, si FEU, nandun ngayon sa Kongreso, nakikinig ng budget, binabantayan yon, pati po yung mga civil society groups, dahil alam nating hindi necessarily interest natin yung ipaglalaban ng mga nakaupo. So I guess that's the kind of, sabi nga po ni Prof. Aquino, parang we're stuck in a loop. No? Nag-hope na naman tayo ng matinong presidente who will appoint good people and change again the nature of the institutions and clean up the mess. Pero what if bad na naman yung result ng roll of the dice, di ba? Parang kung mali na naman yung mauupo, mali na naman yung ilalagay niyang mga appointee and so on and so forth. So I think the challenge of this is just continuous institutional innovation. And I did not mean to to praise too much the American system. I think we can learn from, as Attorney Ruben mentioned, many other systems. But more importantly, we need to innovate ourselves. Don't copy. Parang kung nakita natin nagwo-work doon, figure out why it works, and then see in our context what could work better from what we learned. Pero kung kopya lang tayo ng kopya, hindi necessarily yan mag-work out sa conditions natin. So we need to constantly innovate. So that's how I would frame this. You don't necessarily put a total end to crony capitalism. In fact, as we become a richer country, we're on the cusp of becoming an upper middle income country. Mas maraming opportunities for rent seeking. You know, yung bagong telco, the third telco, yung railway na itatayo sa Mindanao, ang daming lupang sasagasaan na 10 pesos per square meter pa lang. Tayuan mo lang ng subdivision yon, 20,000 pesos per square meter yon afterwards. So ang swerte ng mga sasagasaan niya, di ba, na lupa. I'm sure there will be immense pressure for seeking advantages there from the policymakers, from those in government. And that's why I said, kailangan matatag yung gobyerno natin. Not in the sense na repressive or, napakagastos. Not like that. But matatag yung training nila, matatag yung integrity nila, at saka alam nila kung kanino sila accountable. So right now kasi, pagka may na-appoint na bago, lahat ng bureaucracy, they sort of lean on who is the flavor of the month or flavor of the next 6 years. Instead of going with their mission, going with their long-term reform trajectory, na dapat bagong i-appoint mo, dadagdag lang ng konti doon parang you're ensuring that that's sort of on track, di ba? So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's no 3 months, 6 months to this. Kailangan talaga unti-unti nating ayusin yung gobyerno natin. And right now, that is a prospect, unfortunately, that many Filipinos are losing patience with. So that is our challenge, I think.
Kayo po, Professor Lindy or Attorney Carranza?
Yeah, I agree basically with everything that's been said. It's just I'm really I don't know the answers. I don't really have any answers. But the fact that sometimes we have this thing about you ask Filipinos, they say we have survived 300 years of Spanish rule, another 100 years of American imperialism and this kind of thing. Parang yung nakalusot tayo lahat. So it seems like our patience is endless. That kind of thing. And sinasabi ni kanina, Professor Mendoza, you have to to improve government after all, and its institutions. That's what we mean by institutionalization. And you don't put the same old baloney over there who don't have any. But that's the role of politics, which you cannot avoid intruding into the whole system too. You see, it's really a circular problem that I think every suggestion that has been made has a place in the society to improve certain things, so that we can begin to develop trust and confidence in the government and punishment. I don't necessarily believe that everything should be punished because that would be impossible, but I think government should be like a role model for everything that does to not that it can solve everything, but I think individually each one will have his or her share. Yeah, I guess it's time for a third webinar or something, you know. But this is good. The fact that we are you know, studying all these issues and beginning to care for our society more than just personal enrichment. You know, we have seen the lesson of Marcos and crony capitalism and that kind of thing. So what should be next? You know, other than this, we can you know, survive another 400 years or whatever this is. So that's very dampening kind of hope. So we're back where we started, but I think this has been very useful for every one of us. And by way of parting, before we all disperse, I'd like to thank everybody, co-panelists, the staff, Nella, and the others, Ruben, yourself, and Professor Mendoza. I guess this is what we should be continuing. Over the years, we do it over and over, but maybe we don't study enough the changes that have occurred from the last year to the next or something like that. So I'm sort of a cautious optimist, although I am not really optimistic that problems like we have in the Philippine society you know, can be solved that easily. Yeah, but maraming salamat sa lahat na who was responsible. We should do this every year. Just to remind us, there are things that we need to forget, but there are things that we need to remember for all time.
Okay, maraming pong salamat. Attorney Ruben Carranza, may sagot po kayo sa tanong or mga huling habilin or huling words sa ating
I'll combine them, and maybe I won't be so ambitious as to prescribe anything for the whole country and what it should do. I think that requires a lot of collective reflection and a lot of humility on the part of, I guess, people like us who come from the university, who are privileged to be able to talk like this and to, you know, try to combine theory and experience. But limiting myself to the university, since nandun na rin lang ako, at saka ito na yung, you know, parting words. You know, we talk about, and Ronald mentioned individuals and why it's important to get the right people into the right positions. And we think, let's think about Liling Briones, you know, Dean of the School of Public Administration, Secretary of Education, and what she has not done to help young Filipinos remember the Marcos dictatorship. She was a victim of the Marcos dictatorship. I remember when I was in PCGG and the provincial government of Ilocos Norte wanted to hold a Marcos birthday holiday. I took it upon myself. It wasn't part of my job, certainly, but I wrote to the then Education Secretary Raul Rocco to admonish the Education Department Regional Director and to stop it. And I think that's probably what Ronald meant, that we need individuals who will go out of their way to stop something or to do something. But that's also the problem, because you have my classmate, Harry Roque, UP Law graduate. The UP Diliman Executive Committee issued that statement opposing his nomination to the International Law Commission. But you know, I wonder whether the Executive Committee of UP Diliman will want to do that for every other UP alumni who has effectively enabled a murdering president or a corrupt Marcos family re-emerging. If you're going to do that for every other person you think who deserves it. Naming and shaming, which is why, and I'm sorry to have to do this, you know, why invite Estelito Mendoza to inaugurate a building or a hall in the College of Law, knowing his record of defending the Marcos dictatorship? If you're going to atone or at least acknowledge your own individual role as a Marcos dictatorship official in the past, then take it seriously. And don't just organize a forum like this. Actually, name and shame Marcos dictatorship cronies and enablers who are still alive, and why we can still shame them. So that's a challenge I will probably issue to the president of the university, who was my teacher in corporation law, who was a very good teacher, a very competent legal professor. But I hope also a good person who understands that it takes more than organizing a martial law anniversary discussion to acknowledge the past, to deal with the past. Thank you for everything you're doing today.
Ayan, so maraming salamat po, Attorney Carranza, sa ating mga ibang speakers din po, Dr. Lindy Aquino, saka Professor Ronald Mendoza, sa inyong mga insights na I'm sure marami kaming natutunan, marami kaming napagtanto, at magagamit namin to sa paglaban para sa katotohanan. So, ngayon po, maraming salamat sa pagsama ninyo sa amin sa huling webinar ng UP Days of Remembrance 2021 na may temang Nagnakaw mula sa Kaban ng Bayan. At ngayon, upang formal na tapusin ang ating komemerasyon ng Deklarasyon ng Batas Militar ngayong taon, ating anyayahan ang ating tagapangulo ng System Committee on the UP Days of Remembrance at ang ating butihing Vice President for Public Affairs ng Universidad ng Pilipinas na si Dr. Elena E. Pernia.
Salamat, Jason. Isang magandang tanghali sa inyong lahat at maraming salamat sa inyong pagdalo, pagkinig at paglahok sa ating webinar. Itong nakaraang linggo, mula Lunes, ika-20 ng Setyembre hanggang ngayon, Biyernes, ika-24 ng Setyembre, ay ang ating taunang paggunita ng mga araw ng pakikibaka ng mga taong nagsakripisyo at nagbuwis ng buhay laban sa diktadura at despotismo, upang ito ay hindi na malimutan kailanman at hindi na maulit pa. Ani Professor Danilo Concepcion, Pangulo ng Universidad ng Pilipinas, nung itinayag niya ang UP Day of Remembrance noong taon 2018, higit sa alinman pook dito sa ating pamantasan, sumibol at lumago ang puno ng pagtutol at pag-aalsa. Kung kaya dito rin naman nadama ang bigat ng dagok ng panunupil at pananamantala noong panahon ng martial law ni Pangulong Marcos. Noon din, pinirmahan ng UP at ng Human Rights Violations Victims Memorial Commission ang Memorandum of Understanding para matatag ang Human Rights Violation Victims Memorial sa UP Diliman. This year's commemoration, whose theme is reflected in the title, is in line with UP President Danilo L. Concepcion's commitment to fight against dictatorship and despotism. Titled Dambana ng Gunita, Mga Batayang Katotohanan at Aral ng Batas Militar, this year's commemoration tackled lies, myths, and historical revisionism of martial law and the Marcos regime that are propagated on various media platforms. As in previous years, UP Day of Remembrance 2021 is for all students, teachers, scholars, all Filipinos who wish to continue learning about our country's history and who believe in the importance of upholding and defending basic freedoms, civil liberties, and human rights. This lies squarely within the mandate of the university as enshrined in our charter to provide teaching and learning opportunities for responsible citizenship and the development of democratic values. Gauging from the number of attendees, their questions and comments over the past 5 days, there is great need for education on martial law to fight disinformation and misinformation intended to bury the ugly truth about Marcos and the martial law era. Madalas nang sabihin ng marami na kailangan ng pag-aaral ng martial law sa formal na edukasyon sa antas ng elementarya, high school at kolehiyo. Ito upang linawin ang pilit na pinalalabo at binabaluktot na nakaraan upang makita ng mga kabataan ang korupsyon at paglabag ng karapatan pantao ng panahong Marcos at martial law. As several of our resource persons noted, what could be effective in martial law education is teaching the crimes of Marcos and his regime within the context of teaching human rights and democratic freedoms, protecting human dignity, and developing sensitivity to violations of our basic freedoms. These, after all, are consistent with our Filipino values for malasakit and pakikipagkapwa, values that need to be inculcated for national unity and social cohesion. To the teachers and parents in our audience, and I include myself here, we hold the key to ensure that our young, our children, learn accurate accounts of what happened during martial law and that they exercise critical thinking to resist revisionism. The young deserve an education that empowers them to become more discerning and more discriminating of the information they get online and offline. We have important roles that the young can understand and cherish human rights, social justice, and basic freedoms. From us, they can learn to value and demand for good governance. Ayon uli kay sa Pangulo ng UP, si Professor Concepcion, ang edukasyon, ang mga pamantasan at kolehiyo, ang kinikilalang susi sa pagkamit ng lahat ng layuning pangkaunlaran. Dahil sa atin, nagmumula ang pagbuo ng kaalaman at kaisipan. Dahil may responsibilidad tayong isulong at isiwalat ang totoo at ang tunay upang mabaybay natin ang tama at akma sa hinaharap. Gamit ang mga aral ng kahapon tungo sa mas matibay at matiwasay na bukas. To the young and even the not so young in our audience, I am sure you have heard this very often. The future is yours. And it is vital for you to shape the future that you want now. You who were born after 1980 make up a significant portion of the Filipino population that will make important choices in the year to come. Mula, nagpapasalamat kami sa inyo na nakasama namin itong mga nakaraang 5 araw. Para sa mga hindi nakapanood ng buong serye at para sa mga gustong panoorin uli at gamitin ang mga ito sa inyong mga diskusyon at pagtuturo, ang 5 webinar ay maaari pa ring mapanood sa tvup.ph at sa website ng UP. Naway napagkalooban kayo ng sapat na kaalaman at naging makabuluhan ang mga impormasyon at mga aral na nabahagi dito sa ating dambana ng gunita, mga batayang katotohanan at aral sa batas militar. At higit pa dito, sana ay maibahagi nyo ang mga aral at karunungan na sa inyong mga kaibigan, sa inyong mga pamilya at iba pang mga kilala. Mabuhay tayong lahat. Muli, marami pong salamat. Never again, never forget.
Malayong lupain
Saglit pa ng anaki, kumpol ng bangungot, higit pa ang alambreng tinik ng bimbinan, higit pa ang alambreng bimbinan. Hawakang mahigpit ang pikong panghawan, sa damong nagtabal, giting na lumusog, nakababaliw man ang mikmik sa tagulan, nakababaliw sa tagulan. Sa tanim at anihan, ahas may kumaluskos, bakahin ang tutok, higit pa ang alambreng tinik ng bimbinan, higit pa ang alambreng bimbinan. Lusubin man ang tenga, dumugin ang katawan, tanda ang utak mo'y hindi makapasok, nakababaliw man ang ngit sa tagulan, nakababaliw sa tagulan. Kahit magdamag kang kagatit pangathan, nakawan ka ng tulog ng mumunting hayop, higit pa ang alambreng tinik ng bimbinan, higit pa ang alambreng bimbinan. Walang paghihirap na hindi maibsan, walang makalulugso sa tatag ng moog, nakababaliw man ang niknik sa tagulan, higit pa, higit pa, higit pa. Higit pa, higit pa, higit pa. Ang alambreng tinik ng bimbinan.
Thank you